order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Thursday the 3rd of April 2025. Local authorities in England are responsible for delivering a huge range of essential services to residents, including social care, housing planning and school provision. However, over recent years, local government has come under extreme financial pressure as it battles to continue to deliver these services against the backdrop of rising costs. The committee has heard in its recent inquiries into tackling homelessness and support for children and young people with special educational needs how local authorities are failing their residents as a result of crumbling finances and enormous demand for these services. So today we are very fortunate to have with us a panel of witnesses with huge knowledge, a wealth of knowledge on this subject. We hope to hear their views on the current state of local government finances, as well as what they believe should be done to improve the financial health of local authorities. So before we question government officials later this morning with the benefit of their knowledge and responses to us. So this morning I'm very pleased to welcome a regular attender to this committee, Professor Tony Travers, Professor in Practice and Associate Dean of LSE School of Public Policy. Welcome, Tony. You're very welcome back to this committee. Councillor Pete Marland, I think you've been before us many times too. Chair of the Local Government Association's Economy and Resources Board. Welcome. And finally, by no means least, Iain Murray, Director of Financial Management at the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, commonly known as CIPFA. So all three of you are very, very welcome. We've got an awful lot to get through in the next 3/4 of an hour, so please don't feel you need to repeat anything that anybody's previously said. What I'm going to do is, first of all, we've got a lot of colleagues who've got interest to declare, so let's just get that out of the way. Lloyd, do you have interest to declare? No? Michael?
Please, Geoffrey. Member of Gedling Borough Council and Nottinghamshire County Council until May in regards to Nottinghamshire County Council, Vice President of the Local Government Association, and I am a member of a number of trade unions that represent staff in local government, and they are in my members' register of interest.
Thank you very much. Oliver?
Also Vice President of the Local Government Association, also a member of several trade unions in my declarations of interest that represent local government workers, and although currently not a councillor, was previously a member of the LJ, I think the Economy and Resources Board, when it was just a Resources Board, and was on the exec of the LJ Labour Group for some years.
Thank you very much. Clive Betts.
I'm Vice President of the Local Government Association. I'm a member of Unite Union. I was a councillor, but that's so long ago.
We all thought it was yesterday. Sarah Hall, please.
I formerly was a member of Warrington Borough Council and the Cabinet Member for Children and Young People, and I'm also a member of several trade unions, and they are all outlined in my register of interests.
Brilliant, thank you. Sarah Paul. Rebecca Paul, rather.
Yeah, sure. So
all the Sarahs.
Yeah, lots of Sarahs. No, I'm a Surrey County Councillor, currently serving. I'm also a Chartered Accountant. I'm a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland. I'm also a Chartered Tax Advisor, so I'm a member of the Chartered Institute of Taxation.
Fantastic.
Sorry, Chair, I should also refer, I'm also a member of a trade union, GMB, which will have local government workers in their membership as well.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Seems the Chair's the only one who hasn't got any interest to declare on this one. Anyway, so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask all of you three a sort of fairly opening question where you'll all three be able to have an opening statement, say more or less what you want. Then my colleagues will zero in and ask sort of more precise questions to you. So let's start with you, please, Professor Tony Travers. How do you characterise the current financial health and resilience of local government?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to come and give evidence this morning. I think the position obviously is shaped by a long period, 15 years really, of constraint on local authority budgets across the board. And that came about initially for the obvious reasons for the government of the day to try to bring down the deficit in order to sort of take back control, to use the term, of public finances after the big increase in public spending after the banking crisis. What happened, of course, is that the period of constraint has continued, I think, for longer than was expected, and has led to not just local government spending being lower today than it was in 2010, but local government within its overall spending has protected adult and children's social care, which means that all other services, which tend to be the ones that people see outside their front doors, street cleaning, street lighting, parks, gardens, leisure, and so on. Those services, neighbourhood services, have been put under even greater pressure, and in some cases are spending 30 or 40% less today than they were 15 years ago. So I think it's a long-term impact, but having said that, some local authorities, Section 114 notice and so on, are clearly in extreme distress, though most of those for one-off reasons that are not generic to the whole sector. But there are other local authorities that are actually in quite good financial shape as well. So there's a sort of normal distribution of financial distress, with some authorities with significant problems and others with virtually none. I won't say none, but they are in very good financial condition. And that means operating across the sector, I think, for the government, any government, Form 1 and this one, is quite difficult.
Well, I'm sure we'll want to unpick a lot of that in a minute or two. Councillor Pete Marland, do you want to just start with any thoughts? In addition, don't repeat necessarily what Professor Tony has said.
Yes, it's very bad. Just this year, to deliver the services that we were delivering on March the 31st, there is a £8 billion gap in local government finance just to find in year. I think if you look across the whole of the period that is projected for the comprehensive spending review, that goes up by about the same every single year. So that is just, I think, to deliver what councils are doing now. And I don't think any of us in the room or any of us sort of who talk in local government believe that the current situation, the current services that we deliver are to a level or to a standard that really we want to be delivering on, or that can deliver the government's missions. And I think that that's absolutely critical. So when you look at those two blocks where those biggest spending pressures occur, children's services and adult services, obviously they're highly regulated. There isn't very much you can do about them. But, and I'm sure Iain can comment on this, what level of statutory service that was sort of a 151 officer or a director of adult social care or a DCS, a director of children's services would have said was statutory 10 years ago, is not the mark that actually we would be delivering today. And that obviously has an outcome in terms of the number of children that have to be looked after, the lack of preventative services, the number of people going into hospitals. Other pressures, including temporary accommodation, are obviously new, but that then doesn't sort of countenance what actually local government could be doing to drive reform in, the government announced in the last month welfare changes. And if we were talking about getting people back to work, people who have not been in the work market for maybe a generation or more, actually the level of resource to be able to deliver those services is non-existent. So what I would say is that we can have an esoteric debate in local government around the numbers and becoming sustainable in the terms of, well, you're just delivering your statutory services and bins and a couple of extra things, well done. But as a council leader and on behalf of the sector, I would say that putting up council tax 5% a year is not a choice anymore. It is just to deliver the baseline of services. And we would like, as local government community, to go beyond that and actually deliver real change for our communities and have a choice between, not just a choice between sort of doing this or doing that, but also provide residents with a political choice. Because actually, as things narrow, there is very, very little difference now, I think, between what any political party could offer. And I think it's very, very challenging at that point to sort of say, well, as a politician, as somebody who's responsible to the public, we could do this or we could do that, and I think it takes away that local choice from residents as well.
We will come back in a minute to what some of the cures to what you're saying might be. Iain Murray of CIPFA, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here this morning. So I would echo what Tony and Pete have said. So I think our take is that certainly bits of the sector are either at or beyond a tipping point now. And just to bring some of that to life, so that balance between demand-led services and all the other things that local authorities have to do. Our most recent analysis through our Financial Resilience Index shows that councils in those upper tier authorities are now spending somewhere between 75 and 80% of their resources just dealing with those demands. And if we go back to 2016-17, that was nearer 60%. So there's been a real stark increase in how that is funding being reduced, but demand for those services being exponentially increasing. I think the other issue probably then is to think about some of the short-term measures that have been in play and what those actually mean. So to set balanced budgets in 25-26, 30 councils needed to enter the exceptional financial support regime. So that means that there are 30 councils that without that capitalisation directive wouldn't have been able to balance their budgets, so would have had to consider issuing Section 114 notices. And then I know the committee has had an inquiry into SEN, but the recent analysis estimates that by 2027, the cumulative deficits on those services could be anywhere in the region between £6 and £8 billion, and that's not being recognised in councils' positions at the moment because of a statutory override. So I think once you get behind some of those facts and figures, I think it is quite a stark position, and increasingly councils are being asked to do more with less and less and less. So I think this committee's inquiry is welcome and timely in that respect.
Well, thank you all three very much. That was very helpful opening remarks. I'm now going to pass to my deputy, Clive Betts.
Last, Tony Travers, first of all. Tony, as an independent reviewer of this scene, we've heard now the government are going to bring in reforms as part of the spending review. How optimistic are you that it's actually going to improve and indeed sort out local government's financial sustainability?
Well, the difficulty I think any government would have, and not certainly the current government, it would have been true of the former government, which did try through the fair funding review to look at recasting, especially the measurement of needs underpinning grants to local authorities. The challenge is, because there's been now quite a long period since the uprating of needs within, or needs measurement within the local government formulae, that any change now bringing in loads of new data and new census projection or population projections based on the last census, it's going to lead to significant shifts of spending power from one council to another, inevitably. And the challenge with that then would be is that if most authorities are spending slightly less, in some cases significantly less today than they were 15 years ago, then redistributing funding would simply leave some authorities slightly better off and others even worse off, unless there was a significant amount of extra money at the point of the reform. And the challenge, of course, is that there isn't, for any government, a significant amount of extra money available because of the constraints on public finance.
Your understanding then is that these reforms are really just going to be about moving the money around that exists within the pot?
Well, unless there is inevitably. Now, it's true, the last 3 or 4 local government finance settlements, under the previous government and under this, have been a little bit more generous than those for the previous 11 or 12 years.
You're not optimistic then there's going to be any significant reforms about that would reshape the whole of local government finance in terms of addressing the cause of demand or the money that's raised?
No, I'm not.
Right.
Okay. I thank you for that, and Tony, thank you for that too. Michael Payne, please.
Thank you, Chair. Pete, if I may ask you as a practitioner in local government, the reforms that Clive's just touched on, there's obviously the strengthening of the standards and conduct, there's the local audit system overhaul, the local finance reform in terms of the finance system itself, and now local government reorganisation has been thrown into the mix. 4 pretty big reforms. How do you think they should be sequenced in terms of the government's approach? They can't all come at once, can they? How would you like to see them?
Do we have a choice? So,
not sure, but we are interested in your view.
So I think it's fairly clear that Minister McMahon has a huge agenda in front of him and has had to pick up a pretty broken system. I think there are different functions of those different areas. So I think with the priority pathway and devolution, it's very clear that by the end of the year, most of the submissions will have been made, and therefore that will take up, no doubt, some capacity in MHCLG, and that's happening. It isn't a matter of which would I prefer to see it sequenced. Local government audit is obviously a huge issue in terms of national public accounts. We haven't been able to sign off the national accounts, mainly because of one of the issues in local government is that we haven't been able to sign off many local government accounts, and I'm sure you can say more about that. But I would put local audit at the top of that. And in terms of local government reform and the fairer funding settlement, I think obviously that's going to come through the CSR. And I know the LGA are working, as are a number of organisations, on how that formula will work, and no doubt that will move its way through the system. It will be interesting to see, and the committee might want to form a view on whether when the CSR is done in June or July, whether that is going to be a final sort of this is going to be the funding formula and this is how it's going to work, or whether it's going to be more of a consultation stage, and how that fits in, I think, to 3-year funding settlements, because I think 3-year funding settlements that you didn't ask about, but I think they're extremely important to mapping out sustainability of local government, because it's going to give local government that certainty of how it plans and pairs and smooth some of the changes that might come, such as retention of business rates.
Yeah. And just as a follow-up perhaps to Tony and Iain, you touched on it, Iain, about the exceptional financial support. I think there have been 42 councils since 2020-21 that have been in need of exceptional financial support in terms of a capitalisation order. What else do you think government should be doing to support local authorities immediately? Because there obviously remains an immediate challenge for local government in terms of providing for their local communities.
So I think the money is part of the question. It's part of the questions, or one of the questions we need to answer. But we also just addressing the money doesn't solve the underlying problems, I think. So if we're just reforming funding and then not looking at service reform alongside that, then effectively you're just pouring more money or different buckets of money into different parts of what's already a quite broken system. So I think the bit that's maybe missing or isn't as clear at the moment is, as well as funding formula or funding reform, what are we going to do to the conversation about, well, what are local authorities for, what should they do, and how should they do it? And whilst LGR is obviously a hot topic in the sector at the moment, devolution is a really interesting part of that. So where is the balance between a strategic authority and a delivery authority, and where might different powers sit? So I think that's the missing bit. That's the missing bit for us, which is we can talk about the money, but if we're not changing what the money is being used to deliver, then you're just going to, we're just going to end up in exactly the same problems.
Tony?
I'd certainly agree with that. And just to add slightly to it, I think that there is a need for a longer term sort of stand back consideration of all the changes that you've just listed yourself, which are going on at the same time. And it's an enormous amount for individual local authorities, many of which are having to consider quite substantial reorganisation structurally, brackets. Despite all the excellent consultancy work on the subject, I'm not 100% convinced reorganisations actually save money, but still, we'll see. And with the reorganisation and the reforms to finance going on at the same time, and in the lack at the moment of a developed local audit office, so that is another thing that's happening, I think it's very difficult for the government, with the best will in the world, given that they're giving evidence next, to know exactly what's going on in each individual local authority. It's such a patchwork, it differs so much, and I think that's the real problem. And the exceptional financial support regime is very bad government. It is literally capitalising, it's selling the family silver, and it's not a long-term solution.
Yeah, helpful answer. May I just follow that reply, Tony, if I may? Because I don't think we're going to cover it elsewhere, but I'd like to just sort of cover it briefly, and this is this business of local audit. And in 22/3, only 25% of the councils actually submitted their accounts on time. It worries me that we're in this situation. We're going to even bigger councils with bigger budgets. We really do need to be able to track where this money is going to. I mean, do any of the three of you see any light at the end of the tunnel? That's a solution beginning to emerge to this local auditing problem in the local audit office, or maybe the government, some of those proposals. I don't know whether any of you want to tackle that.
I think my colleagues will know a lot more about this than me, but I just start by saying, I mean, it is an abject failure that so many authorities are so far behind in providing final audited accounts. Some of that's because I think of the lack of oversight, which the abolition of the Audit Commission, and I should declare an interest. I was a member of it a long, long time ago, before it was abolished. So I think that's part of the problem, but also there wasn't enough money in the system to pay the auditors, and that, I think, led to problems as well. So without question, with the existing system of local government, and certainly with one that's about to, major reforms that are going to take place, lots more combined authorities whose finances are very difficult fully to understand, I think we are going to need a much tighter audit regime and the certainty that final accounts are produced as soon as is humanly possible after the end of the financial year.
Got an awful lot to cover, but either of the other two of you want to add anything specific to that?
Without wishing to sort of push back a bit, whilst 25% of councils submitted audited accounts, I think it would be wrong to say only 25% of councils had accounts. Most councils, the vast majority of councils, have prepared accounts. They have just not been audited, and they haven't been able to be therefore signed off. And I'm sure the councillors or previous councillors on the committee will understand that. There is an issue around skills in the sector. There is an issue around pay in the sector. There just aren't enough auditors in the system, and there is an increasing complexity of accounts, and I know a number of you will be from councils where they now have extremely complex accounts, particularly because maybe of wholly owned companies and things like that. But I would push back very strongly on behalf of local government to say this is a local government problem. Our accounts, my own council, sat with the auditor for 2 years. They weren't signed off, and then we got a 56-page report to tell us why they weren't auditing the accounts. The next year we got a 40-page report auditing the accounts. So a report telling us that they were auditing the accounts was longer than the actual audited accounts. So you work that out.
Yeah, that's helpful, Pete. Thank you.
So I should probably, as a former Audit Commission employee and public sector auditor, I should probably be careful what I say. So so it's a huge issue, and it's a massive missing piece of the jigsaw. But it's only one piece in the jigsaw. So I think audit by its nature is a retrospective act, and so there are always going to be limitations around the role that audit can play. I think if the right question to ask is, well, what are the early warning systems? What are the bits of assurance that the sector needs, and where can they come from? I think local audit, the government has grasped the nettle. There is policy that is being developed. It's not going to be easy, and it will be a long road. But I think if we could almost place too much significance on external audit. There are other things in the system which will allow us to get the assurances that we need, spot the problems where they're early enough to be small problems with a small intervention rather than big problems that require massive intervention. So I think whilst it's really important, we might run the risk of placing too much significance on it, and there would be benefit in having a broader conversation about, well, what are the other sources of assurance for government and for councils when they're going through this tricky period.
You might have just segued into your own evidence. Can you just tell us about the CIPFA-led assurance reviews and how that might help?
So we've done. We work with local authorities who find themselves in a difficult position. We've also worked with MHCLG, particularly around the exceptional financial support regime. And I suppose what we find is a number of things. I think increasingly we're seeing that councils who are otherwise reasonably well run are finding themselves in difficulties. But there are always things that councils can do to improve that position. Some of it's not very palatable. Some of it is about, and I'm sure we might touch on whatever minimum service levels might actually be. Some of it is about just controlling day-to-day expenditure. So some councils and I think this is sometimes things that are seen, governance and internal control are not seen as very exciting things, but they're absolutely essential things. And sometimes I think people don't get the basics right. So where we do that work, we obviously try and share those messages with the sector. But I think it is increasingly what we're finding is that we're not walking into councils and finding that it's completely, things are completely out of control. It's just that people are doing what they can do as best as they can, and it's those demands and the funding that we're talking about which is causing the issues.
Time inevitably is moving on. We're going to just have to keep it fairly tight with questions and answers. One question to one person. Anna Dixon, and I believe you may have interest to declare.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for being late. The only interests would be that I've worked professionally on adult social care in the past before coming to this place, and apologies that I've missed the earlier part of this session. So forgive me. I hope that my questions build on what you've already been discussing. The NEO report obviously identifies many different reasons why councils find themselves in the position they are, both financially and in terms of service challenges. We've touched on some of that. From your last remarks there, Mr. Murray, you were suggesting certainly that it's very driven by external funding. Do you see any further opportunities for efficiency and productivity that local government could be taking?
So I think it's funding and demand, and I think you have to consider both of those. I think there are always opportunities for efficiencies and productivity. I think we just need to be careful, again, to think that they might be a panacea that will solve all of the issues that local authorities are facing. I mean, local government reorganisation, I probably would agree with Tony, there will be a cost associated with local government reorganisation. There is a cost associated with any change. There will be some benefits that will be realised quite quickly. A lot of the other benefits, though, in terms of service realignment and some of those efficiencies, they will take time to bed in and to be realised. And I think the issue that I think we're trying, as I would see it, is do we have that time, I suppose, and are we going to see more councils in more difficult positions in the near term before we can get, we can realise some of the benefits associated with those long-term reforms.
I mean, certainly what you said resonates with the Bradford Council, which is the council where I am. They made over the decade up to 2024 some £350 million savings, and I think there's a point comes where there wasn't really any further to go in terms of making savings, which obviously is why they resorted to exceptional financial support, and even with that it leaves a gap. Obviously children's social care costs, we've also heard in this committee about other things like temporary accommodation, costs for out-of-area placements for SEND children. So, are there any of those areas where you think on a cost basis local authorities could be doing things differently to get better value for money?
I think it's quite difficult to characterise the whole of the sector in one answer. I suspect there are pockets of good practice and there are pockets of poor practice across the sector. I do think that if you look at SEND in particular, that if you look at the demand curve for that, it's just huge. So even if you are delivering your unit costs, for want of a better phrase, are as low as you can possibly make them, just the demand means that that's going to be an issue. And the way that demand works in SEND, it's baked in. So the moment that a child is on an EHCP, they're then in need of support for a long period of time. So I know there is talk about writing off SEND deficits. If we wrote SEND deficits off today, tomorrow we would start accumulating a new one. And I think it's those sorts of things which, whilst we can do things in the productivity and efficiency space, and there are opportunities there, whether they will be enough and they will deliver quickly enough to address those problems, I think we should be sceptical about.
Would you like to comment as well on this issue about the funding gap between rising demand? Again, sort of Bradford Council is very typical with 33% of the budget now on adult social care, and even with all the council tax it raises, it can't even cover the cost of children's social care. So even these very statutory, they are dominating local authority budgets, and yet there's rising demand, rising complexity, rising costs. So really challenging for local authorities to bridge that gap.
I think given the committee looks across the whole of government, what's interesting, some of the things we're talking about this morning, so the build-up of deficits on the schools grant, for example, was the result of central government policy change in 2013, was it? 2013, I think. So, and that was a result of a policy change which increased demand, the need for temporary accommodation. A lot of that comes because of Home Office and other policies interacting with the housing system more generally, creating extra demands for temporary accommodation. And if you go further back, reforms to social care funding in the past have led in part to where we are today. So I think the whole of government needs to think in making policy decisions whether those impact on demand for local government services, because at some level, DSG being the clearest example recently, demand increased because of a policy change in Whitehall, and local governments simply had to manage it.
Yeah, so on the social care, obviously that would be the Department of Health and Social Care, where we've got social care reform coming. So specifically there, in terms of the gap, local authorities, we've had evidence from MENCAP, Sense, Home Care Association, all basically saying almost not meeting their Care Act obligations. So I don't know, Councillor Marland, if you want to sort of elaborate further on this challenge between supply and demand, and how you see, not just with changes in policy, but this changes in demand on your services.
I think there are two ways to look at it, and then maybe one outcome is demand can be managed, and it's how you manage that demand and the services you provide to manage that demand. So when you talk about reform, I would say there are two aspects to reform. One is what individual local councils can do to make sure that they are delivering the best value services at the lowest unit costs, and that can mean reform of how you do things. So we have a balanced SEND budget in Milton Keynes. I think we're one of only 12 councils to do it, but that has involved a lot of change, and we've been able to do that in Milton Keynes because we have something called tariff, which, because we grow a lot, we're able to invest in new facilities. We've been able to invest in SEND facilities. We've been able to work in partnership with schools to be able to build them classrooms to make sure that sort of children can be educated in mainstream education. So councils can individually both reform and change the way they do services, but they've got to have the margin to do that, and the margin to do that and the ability to be able to invest in some of those changes has been limited because of the risks in other service areas. So you can't take a risk in one area if by failing you end up having to put it over here and sort of write it off against something else. And then it's what government can do as well. So I think Tony was right, is that government changes often are done in the best interests of policy, but then have an outcome. And then I would say that often we don't focus enough on outcomes in local government. So it is all about, well, we do have a gap. That gap is there, it needs funding, but actually by working with government, how can we bring that gap down by doing services in a different way, both locally, nationally, and sort of by working together on it. And I think that is the fundamental question, is that how can we concentrate on outcomes? Because just pouring money into the SEND system is not going to work, because the outcomes aren't very good. Just pouring money into adult social care is not going to work because the outcomes aren't very good. So I think if we all understood what the outcomes that we wanted as a nation and society, we could then work towards them and understand what sustainable means to get to that point, as opposed to talking about an individual unit being sustainable.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And I have to move on, Anna, please. Right. But thank you very much for that. Michael Payne, please. I'm really sorry. The time is done. Thank you.
Chair, we've recently seen, obviously, record investment in the NHS to try and shift away from treatment to prevention. And so I'm just interested in the panel's views about what the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government and Treasury, working together, should be doing to help local government shift more to prevention at the same time as dealing with the very high demand in services and increasing demand in services that I think all three of you have touched on throughout today's session. Perhaps start with you, Tony.
I mean, it is a fascinating, and I refer to this in my written evidence, a curiosity of public policy that if you look at the period from where you can have good comparable data in 2016 well, actually public health was transferred to local government 3 years before that. It's hard to make comparisons before 2016. 2016 to today, public health spending has fallen by 10% in real terms over that period, and NHS spending has gone up by 20% in real terms. And clearly, prevention would be better than cure. So I do think Whitehall needs to think long and hard, central government, about helping public health function to stop people needing the NHS.
A great example was yesterday, actually, and I think a lot of this is about how it's framed. So yesterday, obviously, the announcement about dentists, and the LGA has asked and was very clear that actually there is a hell of a lot of tooth decay and there are fewer dental places. Actually, more money into preventative services would stop the need for a lot more emergency dental appointments. But I think the framing is really important, because as local government, I think we can be seen to be saying we would like more money, and more money for this, please, as opposed to actually, as Tony's just said, investment in public health can actually drive down the cost and need for dentistry in the same way that it could drive down the need for GP access or hospital access. So I think it's about how we frame this, particularly to the Treasury, around how we can unlock service reform. Where I would just note a little bit of caution is particularly around health and adult social care, is clearly, as an ageing society, we need to make sure people don't go into hospital. But I think, and many of you will know, that our adult social care bill in Milton Keynes is currently split about 55-45 towards people who are 18 to 60 and have lifelong and enduring conditions, and in many places it's about 50-50. There's very little you can do in one sense to keep the costs down on a 25-year-old who is severely disabled and unable to work and has a lifelong condition. That is not a matter of, oh, it's a bed blocking in hospital. So I think, although obviously they can present and end up on unnecessary hospital visits, but whilst there is definitely a huge amount we can do in terms of driving down costs in the NHS, it would be just seen as a little bit, I think, of a golden bullet that sort of like it could fix everything in social care, and absolutely it couldn't, because a lot of cost drivers are completely unavoidable.
So I think the only thing I would probably... So we're doing some work at the moment with the Health Foundation looking at preventative spend in local government, but not looking at the sort of traditional healthcare, social care, healthcare. So I think some of it is actually about acknowledging what bits of spend in local government are investments in prevention or in terms of health determinants for the population, and that includes things like leisure, education, housing, access to open spaces. There's huge amounts that local government spends money on that actually is an investment in the nation's health and well-being. So that's a piece of work we're doing at the moment. I think what it requires is, I'll go back to Pete's point about outcomes. So we have to be clear about the outcomes, but then they have to be shared across government. And so long as a benefit is accruing to a resident or a citizen, it shouldn't really matter where necessarily matter where the cost is being incurred. And until we can kind of have those conversations, I think making the case for change around prevention is always going to be that bit harder than it is at the moment.
That's a very strong case for place-based budgets, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just one final question, if I may, Chair. Just returning to this point about local government reorganisation, do you think that there's a risk that this becomes a huge distraction, that we're kind of instructing local government to reorganise, and that actually people know that potentially by the end of this Parliament many of the existing councils are still going to be in place? And I hear quite a lot, and I'm sure colleagues on this committee do, from members constituents who live in my area that they're quite happy with their local council and they quite like things to stay they're saying they think it's a pretty well run council, and you hear people saying, well, what's my involvement in this as a taxpayer, as somebody who lives in the local area? At what point am I going to be asked my view about the council that's going to be running the services in the future? So I just wondered whether the panel has got a view about the distraction point, and is it a distraction given some of the challenges you've highlighted in today's session, but also community involvement as well?
Very briefly.
Inevitably, it will be a distraction, and there will be short-term costs. So I think there's no question that whatever the long-term potential benefits, which we discuss separately, it will be a distraction and it will cost money in the short term.
Thank you, Councillor.
I think that upfront funding for making sure that proposals for whatever authorities come out of it are sustainable and will work well, and make sure we're mapping that through, because I think evidence is that where that money was invested in counties and districts that were previously converted to unitaries, where that effort was put in up front, there has been more savings, and where there wasn't such a complete review of sustainability, they're the ones that perhaps haven't succeeded.
Can I just ask you, Councillor Peter? I mean, one of the ministerial announcements was, I'm pleased to announce that 7.6 million will be made available in the form of local government reorganisation and proposal development funding. I mean, it does seem to me that 7 million is a drop in the ocean, considering what's going to be done or needed to be done.
Probably have to declare an interest in that. I've heard Minister McMahon speak about this. I think in terms of long-term proposals, worked up transition proposals, that is a low amount, but I think specifically that amount is to work on what the boundaries of proposals may be, and how those new councils would fit together in constituent blocks. I think and what the LGA would certainly hope for is that when the government have decided what the boundaries of those new authorities might look like, then we would hope for more funding for actual implementation plans for those. And so I don't think that 7.8 million refers to implementation plans. I think it refers to what the outline of each constituent authority might be.
Thank you for that clarification. 5 minutes.
Yes, just to Iain Murray first of all. The challenge of local government finance will be bad enough if we're just sorting out the here and now. But when we look forward, we've got this legacy, haven't we, of the deficit built up over SEND. We've got capitalisation for revenue, a number of authorities which effectively are not balancing their budgets now on a day-to-day basis. So what's your view of that as an experienced professional in the finance
easy one
field?
to solve. Thank you. So I think the answers are not easy, and I think Tony alluded to earlier. Actually, government has if we talk about councils having limited tools at their disposal, government has limited tools at its disposal as well to address some of these issues. So some of the things we could think, I think place is a very important consideration in that. And so if we wanted to look at place properly, then, well, what are the freedoms and flexibilities that you might be able to offer places and the local bodies within those places to deliver outcomes for their residents? And how might you then think about funding those differently? So at the moment we have, if we look at council tax and business rates as the two sort of main sources of funding, I think it's a whole session in itself, but those are both areas that are ripe for reform, I would think. So I think there is that role of place. I think within that then you have to think about accountability and responsibility to those. So if we're going to allow places to have greater freedoms and greater flexibilities, we need to think about what guardrails we would put in place, and we need to learn some of the lessons from the recent past where councils were given some freedoms. They were encouraged to use those freedoms to do things with the benefit of hindsight many of them shouldn't have done, and so we need to think about what would be the safeguards we put in place. I think you've got two options, haven't you? You either put more money in, or you reform. You reform, and the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle.
Okay, I mean, we understand that the spending review is going to be a small step, probably about different formula funding. But then there may be a further review of local government finance afterwards, or immediately afterwards. So, Councillor Marland, then Professor Travers, just give your idea about what you want to see in that further look at funding reform.
I think a lot will fall on the government's thinking around the fairer funding formula and how that maps into the total quantum of spend on CSR. I don't really have much more to add to what Iain said, really, in that the system currently isn't sustainable, and it's a little bit like flying a plane while it's on fire. So it's how, as is the NHS and all of these things at the moment, is how do you get to a better future while making sure that councils don't collapse before you get to that new point. I think that's partly what exceptional financial support is meant to be, but it is about, it will fall somewhere between, we do need a quantum of extra money, but it's also about reform of the services as well. Reform of the services, and reform of some of that, reform not just in terms of like policy, but also I think there are around 300 funding streams coming to local government. Some of them are ring-fenced, some of them are not ring-fenced. For instance, Milton Keynes is the 7th biggest economy in the country. I charge 80p an hour for parking in the city centre because it's on-street parking and goes into an escrow account, and I cannot spend it on anything else other than transport-related issues. So it is completely ring-fenced. And yet, if you go just down the road to Oxford, they charge £20 a day. You know, and I'm not saying if any of my, but you know, that local choice is taken away from me because I've reached the point in my own council where there is nothing extra transport-wise I can spend the money on. That is bizarre. So just take those freedom and flexibilities, but also reforming the system.
Right, last word, Tony Travers. Come on,
well, I think
write your own local government reform for us.
One of the challenges of the structural reform, major structural reform, is that a fair amount of it, as we've by implication already said, will be about redistributing loads of deficits. I mean, some councils have got deficits on DSG and indeed in need of, you know, financial support. Others have lots of money in their reserves, and so all of this is somehow going to get redistributed as part of a reorganisation. But I think in terms of the longer term, the operation of council tax and business rates is clearly going to need to be addressed. But the difficulty is particularly with council tax, the longer you leave it unreformed, the more difficult it becomes. And if you suddenly change the basis of council tax valuation, lots of people think that would be a good idea. People have made decisions for over 30 years on the basis of the system as it is. So you'd have to be careful not to bring elements of retrospection into what people were paying tax, the tax they then pay. And that again means the government would have to spend money on softening the blow of any such reform.
Right, that happy note?
So I'm just going to give the last word to an important question, please, to Sarah Hall.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, in my previous life, I was Cabinet Member for Children and Young People, so I have quite a good grasp of some of the challenges in that sector. One of the biggest issues we faced was private providers and residential placement costs. I mean, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. One thing that we try to do is bring some of those services back in-house, but obviously the investor-save projects like this, they are costly, they take a bit of a leap of faith, they take time, and with challenges that councils have in terms of firefighting day to day, that just isn't an option for many. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
We'd like to cover that. Iain, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it is a challenge. I think but other bits of the country are trying to answer this question. So Wales have just, the Welsh Government have just a piece of legislation basically removing the profit incentive from some of those services. And it'll be interesting to see, that's a new piece of legislation, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I actually think that this is where strategic authorities and delivery authorities is an interesting idea, because if you're thinking, I think the delivery of that still needs to sit, the delivery of the service still needs to sit at that local level, it needs to sit close to the point of delivering, close to the point of need. But we're thinking about skills and how you shape markets and those sorts of things. Those would be much better done at a strategic level. And so I think if I didn't get to my go on LGR, but if all we do is just take the existing service services and bundle them together into new unitary authorities, and we don't think about actually what might sit best at better levels, but then it will be a distraction, and we'll miss some of the opportunities that it presents. So I think it's just about thinking about these things differently, and actually local government working with health would have a fantastic opportunity across the local area to shape some of those markets. They understand them really well, and would be able to, I think, have quite significant impact in that.
I think we're going to have to draw a halt, unless you want to very, very quickly come in, Pete.
I think children's social care, as you know, is a really difficult area. Unlike adults, where you can basically do quite strategic and long-term demographic planning, with children's, a family could move into your area tomorrow, sort of in a week's time. You might have 5 children that you need to take into care, 2 of which have got special needs, and suddenly you've got £3 million extra a year to have to spend. And you know, that is a case that probably many of us will have seen. Planning for that, planning for, you don't want to open your own children's home or facility but have nobody in it, so you do need to spot purchase stuff, and getting that balance right between internal provision and spot purchasing is very, very difficult to plan, and that's why sort of a broader base for that strategic planning is very, very difficult. But again, I would come back to outcomes, is that the tragedy of those high cost places, many of them are unregulated, is that it has no basis at all in outcomes. Many of those children will have far worse outcomes than maybe if they stayed with their families.
Yeah, I mean, the solution surely is to take the profit out of the whole process, but...
Thank you very much. Final word to Professor Travers.
I think councils across the country of all parties are very good at managing a mixed economy of public and private provision. Perfectly well run refuse collection services in many parts of the country that are delivered by the private sector. I think the problem is whether the incentives, as has happened with care homes for older people and for children, the incentives in terms of ownership and the temptation of using the income stream as the main focus of interest rather than running it well, putting it delicately, that's where the problem comes. So where we have services delivered by private providers, it's essential to know that the incentives for owners are correct. But you can have a mixed economy perfectly easily.
So can I thank all 3 of our witnesses? We could have probably spent another couple of hours with you, because we've learnt a lot, frankly. So I know you're busy people. We really do appreciate you being here. We're going to take a short break now. The clock is... Should we try and get back on the hour at 11 o'clock? Would be really helpful, and we'll get the other witnesses in. So order Order. Welcome back to the Public Accounts Committee this Thursday the 3rd of April. We now move on to our main session. As we've just heard from the excellent panel of witnesses, local government finance is in crisis. While real-term funding for local authorities grew by 4% between 2015-16 and 23-24, there's not been enough to keep pace with the population growth and the enormous demand for services, nor the increasing complexity of need. Since 2021, 42 local authorities have received exceptional financial support, with 30 receiving support to balance their 25-6 budgets. This is only a short-term fix, as I've no doubt we will examine in a minute, and does not address the underlying financial pressures councils are facing. As we see more and more councils issuing Section 114 notices, effectively declaring themselves bankrupt, immediate action must be taken to address financial health of local authorities to guarantee delivery of essential services so much of our population relies on. We will therefore be questioning government officials on the drivers of financial distress for local authorities, how they plan to support financially failing local authorities, as well as their plans for tackling systemic issues to address the crisis in local government financial sustainability. All of this has to be delivered in the context of a crisis in local government audit and alongside the government's plans to reorganise local government. So today, to help us with all of that, we're very pleased to welcome Sarah Healey, the Permanent Secretary at MHCLG. Sarah's been Permanent Secretary since February 23. Welcome. Will Garton, another regular attender at this committee, Director General for Local Government Growth and Communities, and took on this role in March 2022. Nico Heslop, Director of Local Government Finance. Nico became Director of Local Government Finance in June 2022. And I think, Nico, this is your first time before the committee, so you're especially welcome. Thank you for coming. And finally, another regular attender of this committee, Conrad Smewing, the Director General of Public Spending. Conrad's been Director General of Public Spending at the Treasury since April 2023. So all four of you are very welcome. Now, Clive Betts, my deputy, has a question at the top of the session, which I think, Sarah, you've been warned about.
Building safety levy?
Yes. I was going to ask that, given the building safety levy, its implementation is going to be delayed now till next year. My question was, is that going to impact on the pace of remediation of high-rise flats or blocks with flammable cladding and other safety problems, or will it be that the Treasury has to find more money through the Building Safety Fund if the Building Safety Levy is not bringing in money as early as had been assumed?
Yeah, we've been really clear that delaying the implementation of the Building Safety Levy won't slow down the pace of remediation. We continue to press ahead with remediation at as fast a pace as is possible.
So what will the impact of delaying the levy be?
So you'll remember that in our hearing, the hearing that we had at the beginning of February about building safety and dangerous cladding, we discussed the kind of global sum that will be spent and the fact that some of that will be spent upfront before the building safety levy is collected, but that the taxpayer contribution remains capped at 5.1 billion.
So the estimate is the building safety levy, despite being delayed, will bring in the same amount of money as you initially had forecast?
Correct.
Okay. Just before I go into the main question today, have you done any impact assessment as to what impact the building safety levy will have on developers' ability to fund affordable housing through 106 contributions, given that there's a certain amount of profit made on an individual building site, and if some of that profit goes into the building safety levy, it's not available for 106 funding, is it?
As we discussed extensively during the hearing in February on dangerous cladding, there's a whole range of issues that affect how much affordable housing is built, and developers will take all of those issues into account when pressing ahead and making their plans. There are lots and lots of moving parts. You'll have seen that only last week we announced an extra 2 billion for the Affordable Homes Programme as a bridge forward. So we continue to believe that there are a number of different issues that have an impact on the number of affordable homes
that's
that
an
developers can build.
interesting general answer to a very specific question. But the reality, therefore, is that of all the various moving parts which affect the number of affordable houses, building safety levy is now one of those moving parts, isn't it?
Has been the whole way through, but equally other decisions have been taken which push in a different direction.
Okay, it's helpful just to know, but has any precise impact assessment been done?
I don't believe of specifically on the question that you asked, because I mean ultimately we take a range of decisions. It's a dynamic situation, as we explained at the hearing at the time.
Okay, but that doesn't stop impact assessments being done, does it?
No.
Right. Okay, can I move on then to the issue particularly before us today? Does the state of local government finance give you sleepless nights?
Obviously, we think there are very, very serious pressures in local government. We are extremely concerned about the financial state of local government and very, very worried about the situation that some councils find themselves in. You will have seen that our ministers have been absolutely plain that action needs to be taken to address some of the systemic problems that local government has been experiencing in recent years. There are obviously some areas of the country which have been particularly struggling, some councils which have not been able to balance their budgets in recent times, and that number has been going up. So all of those issues, as well as the kind of overall position of the sector, give us concern.
Yeah. Sleepless nights, yes?
I try not to have sleepless nights. I feel if I'm well slept, I'm probably better placed in order to deal with the sorts of challenges that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
I'm sure we'll go into some of the reasons why in due course on questions about why the situation is as bad as it is and what might be done to put it right in the short and longer term. But one of the problems surely you have is that you can't actually know, can you, how bad the situation is, because there are so many authorities who haven't got audited accounts.
I think, as you discussed with Will and Conrad at the hearing on the whole of government accounts, we obviously take the gaps in local audit extremely seriously and have a programme in place to address them and try and bring them up to date. At the same time, audit is one amongst a range of tools that we use in order to understand the financial position of local government. I think those were all sort of listed out as part of that discussion at that hearing. I could go through them again, but we think they give us a pretty sound understanding of the position of local government. Obviously not good enough, and we would prefer to have audited accounts, but equally audited accounts are inevitably a little bit retrospective, and we like to keep track of data on a sort of ongoing up-to-date basis. So it's absolutely the case that that audit is important to this, and that having up-to-date audited accounts for the whole of local government is critical. But equally, we do think we have a pretty solid understanding of the financial situation of the sector and indeed of individual councils.
Well,
no council individually has come to us with an issue of financial distress that has been a surprise to us.
Right. So you may have been surprised in the past on occasions, but you won't be surprised in the future.
No, we've not been surprised.
No, on cases to date, we've known about an issue in a local authority before they have come to us. So we are, as we talked about in January, we are really think we have a good grip of the size of the problem, the extensive problems that exist in this sector, despite the unacceptable state of the audit market. That goes into the tools, the financial sustainability tools that we've worked with the NAO to show them, and I think they don't want to put words in the NAO's mouth, but they've been relatively complimentary about our ability to do it. We take insight from public interest reports and value for money reports that auditors do, and we do a ton of sort of soft engagement.
Well, fine. Therefore, you're aware of what's happening, not with general, but with individual councils. So you don't expect therefore, any 114 notice to be served in the next few months.
We're not making a prediction going forward on the health of particular authorities. We are saying that why are we confident that we have a good understanding about the financial risk and complexity in the sector? Because retrospectively, all of the authorities that we have dealt with, both in terms of EFS and 114, have not been a surprise to us. So we're not making a forecast going forward, we're looking at our past record.
Well, surely that's the whole idea of not having the information, that you can make forecasts, isn't it, to anticipate what's happening?
And as a result of that, we do have we know who we're worried about going forward as well. Absolutely.
You have got worries about some authorities.
Oh yeah.
I mean, inevitably.
Yeah. I mean, yes.
Might have to declare 114.
Well, could I just clarify? Obviously, local authorities issue 114, and that is a decision for the local authority. They also issue Section 114s for a range of reasons. I think we have, as Will and Sarah were saying, we think very good understanding of local authorities who are, who are having financial difficulties. We could not predict at all that a local authority may come out and say they have discovered an historic issue with their accounting treatment of something, and therefore they are issuing a Section 114. So I think there's a distinction between our understanding of every local authority and every single account and the general pressures on local authorities.
Just to knock on the head, because we've got so much to cover this morning, and given that this local auditing is so important, and it is really important not only for you in the centre, it's important for council officers, it's important for councillors themselves and members of the public to understand what's maybe going wrong in their council. So it's really important that we do start to make inroads on this. Can you give us an up-to-date on what your discussions are on the local auditing office proposals are, please?
Yep. So since we discussed this in January, we discussed, you'll recall, the backstop, which is for the year 22-23, which was in February. We've now got about where we said, if you recall, we want to see audited accounts. They may be impaired. They may be disclaimed, but we want audited accounts, and we've now got returns from about 94% of the sector, so there's still 6% missing, and we are chasing that down relentlessly. But that is a better position than we were previously, that's for the year 22-23. Our intention is to introduce primary legislation in the English Devolution Bill to set up the local audit office, so instructions will be given to OPC as we speak to get that right. That is a change in policy from the previous administration, so that is following the recommendations of this committee, of the Departmental Select Committee, of Redmond, of Kingman, all of those bodies. That is happening. And our objective remains that by the end of the year, financial year 27-28, there are no disclaimed or qualified accounts because of audit per se.
A really helpful answer. Thank you very much, Will Garton. Michael Payne, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Question for Nico, if I may. If you just take the year 2023 to 24, I think I'm right in saying that £72.8 billion revenue spend by the government across the board. How do you ensure value for money? Because there are still significant challenges, obviously, for councils across the country. Numbers of looked after children going up, pressures in adult social care, children's services. It's a significant amount of taxpayers' money. How do you ensure from your department that there is value for money in terms of the support that you're providing for local government?
Well, I mean, I think there's a long-standing kind of accountability mechanism between central and local government. Sarah is the accounting officer for kind of local government spend overall, but within that framework, local authorities and the chief executive and the statutory positions, the Section 151 officer and the monitoring officer, the sort of head of legal in local authorities, they are responsible for individual decisions taken on projects, on spend. So that is a kind of long-standing arrangement in terms of how we interact with local government.
You're satisfied that the department's getting value for money in terms of the spend that it's making across local government?
I think we would always look to see whether we can achieve greater efficiency, greater productivity, whether there are reforms to services that could be undertaken to kind of improve the efficiency, the value for money of things. We set out in the spending review, in the local government finance settlement for this year, a number of changes, including increased investment in prevention spend on children's social care and on homelessness, which are absolutely about trying to improve the efficiency, the effectiveness of spend in those areas. So we will, and that will, I'm sure, be a feature of the spending review discussions over the coming months.
You, just on the revenue streams available to local councils, I think 2013-14 was the last time the indices for funding formula were properly reviewed. 91-92 was the last time there was a revaluation in terms of council tax. Business rates reform is long overdue and has been called for by the sector for an awful long time and yet still hasn't been delivered. Do you think there's significant flexibility in terms of the revenue streams that council's got in relation to council tax, in relation to business rates, in relation to the other revenue streams that they've got to be able to deliver on some of the immense challenges I think we heard from the pre-panel that the sector still faces?
I mean, the government set out a consultation on funding reform in December, which ran for 2 months, closed in February, which set out the proposed set of approaches on those range of issues that you've highlighted there, all of which are very familiar to us and which we recognise are very much in need of reform. First on the distribution of funding and trying to make the distribution of funding much more closely allied to needs and demand and changes in demographics, in levels of deprivation and in the need for services. Also, I think in the value for money that we think we could get out of greater funding simplification, so removing the sort of individual stream of grants that local government has to receive and report on, whether it's ring-fenced or otherwise, to give them greater flexibility to meet need where it is most felt and where it is best understood, closer to the citizen. To have multi-year settlements, I think, is a crucial part of trying to achieve greater efficiency in local government, because obviously when you have, as the NAO report makes clear and as this committee has said before, single-year settlements make it very difficult to plan for reform of services in order to get greater value for money. And you'll also obviously be aware that the range of issues where local government is really feeling extreme demand pressures at the moment, so children's social care, special educational needs and disability, also homelessness, are all areas where government is looking, and indeed adult social care are all areas where government is looking very, very carefully at what reforms can be introduced in order to improve the quality of services and manage some of those demand pressures on local government.
Do you think, Sarah, that the sector can expect by the time of the spending review, or at least the next provisional local government finance settlement, a complete overhaul of those indices funding formula that haven't been reviewed since 2013-14? Because if I just speak from my own local authority, Gedling, your baseline figure, which is used in the NAO report for 2015-16, you talk about the global uplift in core spending every year. My own local authority is in a negative core spending position compared to 15-16. If you take that as a baseline position, and that position for my own local authority, Gedling, is not going to change unless and until there is a complete overhaul of that indices funding formula that hasn't been reviewed since 2013-14. So I think colleagues in the sector are really keen to hear from you. When will they see that overhaul of the...
You've seen the consultation, so you know exactly what we're looking at working through and doing for the next local government finance settlement. I think it is worth highlighting that obviously there will be some transitional and implementation arrangements here, so we're not going to be switching to a completely new approach to this overnight. You wouldn't expect us to. That would be too much variation in funding for councils to receive and deal with overnight. So we will set out some transitional arrangements when we set out exactly what the changes we expect to happen to the distribution of funding are.
But it's unlikely we'll see a complete overhaul of those indices of funding formula by the spending review.
That's what we've consulted on.
We've consulted on the principles around that, absolutely. We will put out another consultation after the spending review, most likely in June time, and I think that will set out further detail and will give local authorities a kind of good indication of where they may end up through the system. As Sarah said, we will also need to set out details on transitional protections, but the consultation responses we have had have been overwhelmingly supportive of updating all the things, and many have not been updated since 2014. Some go as far back as the 1990s, so I think everyone is agreed that updating them is very, very important.
Thank you.
Smewing, can I just pick up one thing the Permanent Secretary said, and this is this multiplicity of funding streams. Now, we've not got education or health in the room represented. It sounds from what the Permanent Secretary said as though MHCLG itself is making progress on reducing those funding streams. Can you in the Treasury assure us that it is top of your priorities in terms of local government funding, that you will be reducing number of these streams?
And absolutely give that assurance. So, I mean, the Treasury is foursquare behind the whole local government finance reform approach that MHCLG is taking, and where there are areas where we can be particularly helpful, and consolidation of grants is one of those. We are absolutely putting that front and centre of the spending review.
And I should say, kind of, when I talked about reducing the number of grants, I didn't just mean MHCLG grants, I absolutely meant across government. So I know that the NAO report makes a point about the extent to which MHCLG kind of has decision-making power over what kind of the rest of government does. You know, we may not have a sort of veto as such, but we do have extremely good relationships with the departments that also are the main sort of funders of local government, and indeed work very closely with the Treasury. And I think the sort of need to reduce the number of funding streams to local government in order to get best the value for money that we need is very well understood across my fellow permanent secretaries.
That and your other statements about multi-year settlements will make the administration of local authorities much easier.
Yes.
Clive Betts.
Right. The national insurance increases for employers. Local government, where it employs people directly, are being protected, but a lot of local government services are provided by organisations who are impacted by those changes. To what extent has an analysis been done, either by the Department or by the Treasury, about what the impact of those changes is, and has local government been given money to actually help smaller charities in particular who have been put into additional financial pressure because of these increases?
I'll pick up the overall position, and then Nico might want to say something about local government in particular. So the approach that the Treasury took for compensating public authorities for the national insurance contribution rise was essentially to take the macro figure from the Office of Budget Responsibility of the expected amount of national insurance contributions increasing from public sector authorities. Look at those and then divide that with, between the different workforces that are classified within the public sector. That obviously means that for private sector companies, the national insurance rise has an impact on them. That's the purpose of the tax policy change. You need to get the tax in order to fund the increase in public spending that the autumn budget put through. That means the OBR's assessment of what happens to that tax burden is that it is split between wages and profits. So there is an impact on both employees of those private companies and the profit of those companies. How that is divided up is is very difficult to see from a sort of macro level. The approach there is that to the extent that tax burden on a private sector organisation results in changes in the prices that they charge to the public sector, that would be taken into account in the overall funding for that sector over a period of time. It would take some years to come through. These kind of edge cases exist in a large number of public services, so in health and in local government as well. So that was the overall approach we took. I don't know, Nick, if you want to say something about local government in particular.
No, exactly. And then specifically on local government, the approach that Conrad set out gave us a figure of £515 for the direct costs, and we then took a decision about how to allocate that funding. We talked to the sector and we decided to allocate it in a certain way so that we didn't discriminate against authorities who had chosen to insource or outsource versus various services. A little bit of a technical about what line we chose to do that with, but we adjusted our approach based on feedback and consultation with the sector.
What impact assessments again has been done on the ability of local authorities simply to fund existing services out of that extra money to cover the costs of national insurance? Now I've been along to see two organisations in my constituency, Women's Aid, who run a provision for women fleeing domestic violence, Care in the Community, who look after people with long-term disabilities in a lovely setting on Bayton Road in my constituency. Both organisations have got the pressures of the national insurance increase and the wage increases, which they welcome, and they get no help. I mean, those organisations will just about survive this year. They can manage, I think. But if it just rolls through to next year, they're going to be looking at cuts to really basic, essential services.
I mean, absolutely understand the pressures that some of those organisations are facing. I think we might get into this later, at every spending review we look in the round at local authority spending and need, and the changes to national insurance were factored into that assessment. We put in through the kind of autumn statement and then the LGFS an additional 5 billion in grant funding specifically on adult social care. We put in an extra 880 million pounds of funding to support adult social care, and in total we made available an additional 3.7 billion pounds to social care.
So it's actually community integrated care, so the name of the company. But so an organisation like that, you're saying there's enough money going into the system for Sheffield Council and other councils to fully compensate organisations like that delivering a really important local service for the extra costs of the national insurance increase?
I can't speak to the specifics of whether Sheffield and the link between that. I think in a general principle we looked at all of the funding pressures for local government in the round and provided a significant uplift in funding.
You're saying there's enough money gone in the system for all these organisations to be compensated by councils throughout the country?
I think what we're saying is that we did the best estimate that we could, considering the position that the information that we had. What individual councils decide to do and how they decide to address it is not something we can control or comment on.
Right, okay, but it's not the impression we're getting that the money really has gone into the system to compensate for all these extra costs.
We've put quite a lot of extra money into the system, and obviously some of that money was available because of increased tax take. So again, it's one of those situations where there's lots of moving parts when settlements are made.
Thank you very much, Clive. Anna Dixon, please.
Yeah, I just, before moving on, want to just pick up where my colleague Clive Betts finished there. So particularly looking at the adult social care sector, back in 2021, the NAO published a report on the adult social care market in England. And even back then, with data going back to 2019, found that there were a significant number of large providers were not financially resilient. And at the time, there was a suggestion that we needed to be putting in place clear and comparable information over those fee levels to really get a grip on, how much was being paid to social care providers. Now, here we are in 2025. We've got evidence from MENCAP, and I know this as well from speaking to other not-for-profit charitable providers of both health and social care in my local area across the Bradford district, who are saying they're going to be forced to renegotiate and potentially hand back social care contracts. In Bradford district, they have taken the decision to fully fund the national insurance increase with social care providers, but some councils are not doing that. And I just feel like saying this is entirely down to local councils. Is there nothing that you are doing as MHCLG together with DHSC or indeed CQC to be trying to do more to ensure that money does reach social care providers, and to put in place plans that where social care providers are going to be handing back contracts to mitigate the gaps that might emerge in terms of provision for older and disabled people?
I mean, yeah, we work obviously, as Sarah said, incredibly closely with the Department of Health and Social Care. They have done a lot of work to try and improve the transparency of markets. We have a specific funding stream within the local government funding settlement, which is the market sustainability and fair cost of care, which is absolutely about, whilst giving a degree of discretion to local authorities, is absolutely about tackling some of the things that you've suggested. That was worth £1 billion in 25-26, and I know that the Department of Health are continuing to think about whether there are other things that are needed in that space. But as you say, some authorities have done it, some authorities have not done it. So I don't think that is off a sort of stepping back from the issue, but I think it is just how, as back to the original question about the kind of accountability system, that is how the accountability system works between central and local government.
There are no ways in which you can guide as to what the intention was behind this exceptional funding and other things.
We talked earlier in the hearing about the need for fewer ring fences and more integration into local authority budgets. The chair described it as a crisis in his opening. I think the Deputy Prime Minister has used that as well. Our position is that the least worst thing you can do, and I accept that there's not enough money in the system. We're not really having to until the reforms come through. We need more money. We need to use the money in the system more efficiently. But I think we can't be in a position where we say to individual local authorities, you should use your funding in this way, and to a different local authority, you should use it in that way, because we don't have an adequate view. We want that decision to be made locally. That's not hiding from the fact that it's incredibly tough out there and it is difficult. But there's a big risk to us mandating from the centre that it should go through to a care provider or it should not. We want local authorities to make that decision because they are best placed to do so.
Can I just come in here? I mean, Conrad and Dixon has usefully taken us to the MENCAP evidence. Within that evidence, it says the Health Foundation estimated the social care spending per person in 24/5, when age adjustment for the population would be around 5% lower in 2009-10.
Well,
now, it's all very well. No, can I just finish the question, Sarah, please? It's all very well saying local authorities should make their decisions on these matters, and that might be true if one service was under pressure. But when every service is under pressure and they're having to make invidious choices on every single service, it's a very difficult position for them to be in. So I think the core of my question is, can you tell us anything at the moment about your likely reforms as to how this situation is likely to be put right?
Yeah, I suppose I'd sort of slightly take issue with one of the things you've said in your question, which is that we should not take so much of an interest in kind of how people are kind of spending their money if everything is under pressure. I think that's precisely the point at which we should try to be moving, as our reforms have set out, to more flexibility for local government to decide how funding should be spent. On your point about what is available in terms of like social care need and pressure versus the kind of the level of funding, the sort of sum, I can't comment on the specifics of the number because I don't have any of that analysis in front of me, but it wouldn't be surprising because precisely as our consultation on funding reform and distribution sets out, the level of assessment of need has got very, very out of kilter with where that need is in the demographic and other changes that have happened since those formulas were set. And that is precisely why we set out a consultation which takes into account a whole range of different things from demographics, from deprivation, we talked about it before, just levels of population, age of population, and therefore to make the best possible assessment of need as we look at the formulas that inform the local government finance settlement. I don't know if Nico, you want to say anything else?
No, exactly that, but just that also within that change, we are specifically looking at updating formulas for children's social care, for adult social care, for exactly the reasons that Sarah says.
Yeah, can I press a little bit further? We heard from Professor Tony Travers in the pre-panel that so much of the demand that local authorities are having to meet is effectively a result of national decisions and national policy setting. So whether that's in SEND, temporary accommodation for homelessness, adult social care or children's social care, clearly whether local authorities can meet demand or not is also partly driven by action that other departments, along with yourselves, are taking on a number of those issues. So my question was going to be about sort of, we just see demand on every of these areas going up. We see data on complexity going up. There's plenty of data, Age UK, on unmet need, 2 million older people, unmet care needs, Health Watch saying 1.5 million working age adults have got unmet care needs. That's from the Home Care Association evidence that was submitted to this committee. So how are you working to support local authorities to take action nationally and locally to curb demand and pressure?
I think I set out earlier that if you think about the main drivers of demand here, and I completely recognise the picture that you're setting out in terms of how all of these areas are just kind of like the demand levels are going up, even in councils that are in relatively good financial positions, and that's why we're now in a position where we're seeing serious financial problems in councils, not because of serious mismanagement, as we have done in the past, but simply because of the pressures that they're under. If we look at each of those areas, while I would, absolutely love to be able to tell you the specifics of what reform plans are in each of those areas, what I can tell you is that in all of them there is very significant work underway within the government on what those reforms are going to look like. This committee took evidence from the Department for Education on special educational needs and disability and the reforms that are needed there, and I know that you've highlighted the need for a kind of really clear plan to try and manage demand on that and kind of deal with some of the, for two reasons, both in order to improve out, in all of these cases, this is about improving outcomes as well as kind of dealing with the local government's financial position. So that's special educational needs and disability. As Nico said, we've really put extra money in to try and address some of the demand pressures on children's social care by moving some money towards prevention, and the Department for Education are obviously highly conscious of the issues and pressures that have arisen there as a result of failures in the market. Homelessness, as the hearing we did in front of you at the beginning of December set out, we will be producing a strategy on homelessness that looks at how we can address some of those pressures come after the spending review. But we are anyway taking action when it comes to affordable and social housing. The 2 billion that I mentioned earlier is all about making a long-term difference to the availability of housing in order to manage those pressures, but we are also looking at how we increase prevention expenditure in the short term to try to address some of the issues that have arisen in a lot of councils on temporary accommodation, which obviously the demand has sort of hugely increased just in the time that I've been the permanent secretary at MHCLG, and we've been very, very, very conscious of that, and clearly the KC review is underway looking at adult social care. So I realise none of those are kind of like, here is our very kind of clear sort of set of reform plans in each of those areas, but I hope it is clear from the answer that I've given that we recognise the demand pressures that come from each of those main policy areas, and there is action being taken in the relevant government department, which is sometimes us and sometimes others, to try and manage those down by reform of the services.
I think obviously local authority leaders would probably be pleased to hear that there is plans now being put in place for strategies on all of those demand areas, and indeed the reforms that we were hearing earlier from you about local government financing. But those councils like Bradford Council that are already in exceptional financing, who because of half of their budget being cut in terms of the central government grant over the last 10 years and the inability in such a poor area to raise those revenues through business rates and council tax to make up for those cuts. They had spend down reserves, they're selling off assets, they're going to be owing money because of the exceptional finance that they've been provided. I can't see how they get from here to there and how they're going to have any bandwidth whilst they wait for new settlements, transition funding and wonderful, joined up cross-departmental strategies on all of these areas. So what is your message for, how are councils in that position supposed to bridge the gap and continue to meet even their statutory needs in terms of social care, temporary accommodation? Between a rock and a hard place, so Treasury and you... completely understand the picture that you're setting out. That is the picture that has driven the need for these fundamental reforms. I think we all wish we hadn't been in a position where we had a one-year settlement last year. That wasn't, an ideal situation, but we did what we could within that one-year settlement to start to try and address some of these problems. Nico, you look keen to say
absolutely.
more.
We've, as you know, Bradford has been in receipt of exceptional financial support for the last 2 years. We have worked incredibly closely with Bradford, I think in a very kind of collaborative way, recognising absolutely the picture that you have set out. As Sarah said, in a one-year settlement, we did as much as we possibly could. Ministers took some difficult decisions, but specifically for Bradford, it led to a 9% cash terms increase. You got £17 million from the new recovery grant that we introduced, which is specifically targeted at need and deprivation. And I know from kind of first-hand experience speaking to the council, speaking to the Children's Trust, that the kind of big thing that Bradford are trying to do is almost reform their children's services in a way that I suspect the longer-term plan on children's service reform will happen, and that is the way out of it. So totally recognise, and listening to some of the evidence that people particularly Iain Murray was saying about exceptional financial support, like exceptional financial support is part of a toolkit. On its own, no one is here is pretending it's a solution, and that is why we've set out the plan. And I'd just reiterate what Sarah said, that post the spending review and ahead of the financial settlement for 26-27, which will be the first multi-year settlement in a decade, I think that we will be able to set out a lot more information and a lot more certainty to authorities, both on the funding reform, on the significant consolidation of funding, and then in each of those major service areas that you've set out in the report.
And I welcome that we're at the beginning, and obviously pay tribute to the Chief Exec, the Council Leader and the Head of the Children's Services for the progress they are making under extremely difficult circumstances to at least try and turn this around. And I think it's really important to recognise that, you know, whilst in some councils there is a history of perhaps financial mismanagement that's put them some bad decisions to get them there, there are other councils that, in the face of very high need and very significant cuts to funding, have been having to make some very difficult decisions. But I think I'll leave it there for the moment, Chair.
I want to come in on this.
Okay.
Because, as I said at one of our previous hearings, Permanent Secretary, there's usually a reason for a 114 notice. I do accept that, and you've had 7 of those. But it always results in less and more expensive services. Look what's happening in Birmingham at the moment. So Section 114 is always a disaster. But even the exceptional financial support is a disaster too, because it means that those councils are either selling off capital assets or they're borrowing more. So this is really not a solution, as you were saying, Mr. Heslop. It's a disaster. Now, we really do need to tailor what that demand is in all of these services and fund it properly. And you've got all these reviews going on, but how long is it going to take? Because at the moment what's happening is people on the ground, as Clyde has said, in his constituency, are suffering. They're getting less and less services each year.
No, I really, really recognise that. Obviously, it's really important when you're reforming something as fundamental as something like the special educational needs and disability system that so many vulnerable children and parents rely on, that you get that right. Clearly the reforms that were done in 2014 have led to a sort of very significant expansion in demand, but I don't think if you ask parents or children that they feel that has been matched with quality and kind of service in what they've experienced in that system. So it's important we get this right. We've got an opportunity to do that alongside funding reform, and we should get that right in all of the areas that I've talked about in terms of demand. I think our funding reforms, we're going to we've already started seeing some changes in the way that we did the settlement last year, but it was, as I say, unfortunately only a 1-year settlement. We will see very much more significant change, as Nico set out, when we come to the first multi-year settlement for a decade. I don't think any of us, and Will might want to come in here, think that exceptional financial support is a sort of long-term strategy to kind of deal with local government funding. It is a short-term intervention to handle the situation that we're in until we can make those more fundamental changes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your analysis that we can't rely on exceptional financial support, otherwise it doesn't become exceptional, but becomes the norm and we become acclimatised to it. I mean, I would say if we're now in the early days of 25, 26, we are starting to do things now. So I know it can feel like it's all taking a long time, but from 25-26 there is a new children's social care formula which will better distribute the money that we have according to need. There's a bill in front of Parliament, the Children's and Wellbeing Bill, that gives the Department for Education the option in extreme circumstances to cap the profits that providers are making in children's services. We are already reallocating, following the McAllister review, and already reallocating money from the acute end to prevention in terms of children's services. So that is happening. But as Sarah articulated, the reforms that we are undertaking are so significant and haven't been done for such a long time, since 13-14, as the NAO report sets out, that to do them overnight would lead to huge losses in one part of the system and massive gains in other parts of the system, and that in itself would make the system unsustainable. So you can't be done overnight. We are going as quickly as we possibly can because we recognise the really, really difficult financial situation which we're articulating. But our intention is that as a result of the reforms, as a result of the spending review, the whole sector is much more sustainable towards the middle part of this Parliament than it is currently. But it's started. It just takes time.
All right, thank you for that, Will. Oliver, Ryan, please.
Thank you, Chair. my question, I suppose, is for Mr. Heslop and Miss Healey. And I want to talk a little bit about service quality, accessibility and democracy and what that means. Of the £72.8 billion of revenue spent by councils this year, £42.3 billion was spent on adults and children's services. 77% of spend as a median figure across councils is spent on statutory services at the statutory amount that they have to be delivered. Rising demand isn't going away. Temporary accommodation costs have risen 54% in the last few years. London spends something like £4 million a day on temporary accommodation. EHCP plans are up 140% since 2015. Children in need rates, adults costs are up somewhere like 30% since 2018. The average cost for a looked after child currently stands at £97,000 each, with some multi-thousand pound placements being demanded in some cases. Fostering costs are up. By 2027, deficits in SEND will be £7 or £8 billion a year. All in, we've heard from Councillor Pete Marland earlier that there's a £7 or £8 billion gap in the whole sector this year, and local government spending as an amount is lower today than it was in 2010. In the context of that, complaints are up, wait times are up, accessibility for residents is down. The practical collapse and the effectiveness and delivery of local government services is, yes, because of 14 or 15 years of restricted finance, but because of a number of other issues. And I think this undermines our democratic system, people's confidence in government, because councils can't do the basics, but they also can't do the big strategic things that the new government requires them to do. It's been touched on before now.
We can pause there, and otherwise the witnesses won't be able to answer it all.
I'm coming to a question.
Okay.
I am coming to a question. I just feel like I need to set out a context.
I was just trying to find the bit of the report.
There's a long context. There's a long context, but it's building to a point. I put it to you that as much as we're looking at reform, and we'll come on to it slightly later, in things like finance and reorganisation, that what we actually probably need is big change, and that the department as it's currently set up, the system as it's currently set up across England and Wales at least, just isn't fit for purpose. That adults and children's probably needs to be separated out because of service quality, accessibility, because of democracy really. The whole system has fallen over. And I put it to you that probably what we don't need is bitty reform. We probably need to just start again, don't we?
So I'm going to just say a few things in response to the very many things that you covered in your question. The first would be that obviously a decision about whether you want to do fundamental and major system reform is for politicians and not for us. So kind of you could ask that question of our ministers. I'm sure they'd have something to say to you to kind of reflect on why they've decided to take the approach that they have. The other thing I'd say is that actually we think we are embarked on big reform, very big reform, and we also think fundamental reform of the system, and we think that we are reforming pretty much all of it, and in a way which is actually quite consistent and is being done in quite a kind of coordinated manner that we have thought about quite carefully. So I would sort of both say, if you want me to kind of decide to sort of redesign the entire care system, I'm going to kind of say to you that that's not for me to do. But if what you're saying is, does this need fundamental, big, consistent, carefully done reform in all areas of its operation, then that's what we think we're doing.
Can I just add as well, I mean, Sarah is exactly right, but also our ministers have been very, very clear that the kind of plan we've set out and the 3-year spending review, as Will said in his previous answer, is about bringing much greater stability to the sector. I think if we embarked on some of those massive ideas that you said where we are at the moment, I think you'd probably be telling us that we're ripping it up and it's all too risky. And so I think the first step must be to, and I wouldn't describe them as bitty reforms. If you look at the funding reforms, if you look at local government reorganisation, children's social care, homelessness, potentially things on SEND, those are the pressures identified in the NEO report. So I think by the end of this spending review period, we'll be in a different place, and then there are questions about whether ministers want to go further.
Just as a follow-up, I suppose, do we just accept that because of local funding decisions that have been taken, that service quality and accessibility will fall?
Well, precisely our reforms are all about saying no, kind of they're are there ways to make these systems better and ensure that funding better meets need? I mean, a little bit like I said about special educational needs and disability. The amount of money spent on it has gone up. Are parents and children more satisfied with the system? No. So the reforms are all about changing that.
Yeah. Same on children's social care as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we are spending less on prevention. We are seeing more children entering into the care system. That the amount of children entering into foster care has gone down. The amount of funding invested in kind of early support has gone down, and that is those things are exactly what the reforms that we've begun are trying to change.
Sorry, Chair. What I'm slightly cautious of is that we do a few of these hearings, and we have people from different departments, and there's always kind of some reform or something that's coming just over that hill that will save us. But for the time being, it doesn't work. And it feels like we're sort of accepting that for the time being it doesn't work, but if we can just reach that hill, it'll be fine. And that doesn't kind of cut it for residents that I've got.
Yeah, I mean, I think we go back to Will's point. We've started making changes. This is a very, like you said, Chair described it as a crisis. It's been experiencing increasing difficulties over many years now. It's not going to be fixed in the course of a few months.
And you don't need me to tell you, but it's all in an incredibly difficult fiscal context for obvious international reasons. You don't need me to explain those to you. Money is tight. Like, times are difficult. So we are, we would love it if there was largesse and we could just spend our way out of it. That's not an option open to us for obvious macroeconomic reasons. So we have to look at how we're using the £69 billion settlement better, more efficiently, more productively. We've got a huge reform, for example, on the mayoral agenda. We announced sort of only 8 weeks ago that 8.5 million people are getting a mayor that didn't previously have one by next May. There's a sort of economic development aspect to this. We're trying to integrate services at a local level by making the mayor, the police and crime commissioner, the chair of the integrated care board, linking up with probation services, coterminous with local authorities. We're having fewer local authorities through local government reorganisation. We're trying to shift money away from prevention. So from where we sit, it does feel bold and radical and a big transformation. I totally accept, though, that if you are a citizen, life still feels squeezed, but it's still difficult, and it's just it's not within our gift. We just can't fix everything. Try as we might, because the challenges are really hard. But I think it is fair to say that we're running at it at a fair pace.
I'll just ask you, Garton, you've just set out a list there of government's aspiration of how it wants to reform local government. Is the idea that it's going to save money or produce improved services, or both?
I think we can make the sector more productive through more place-based thinking. We're not going to have... we obviously see what is allocated to local government at the spending review. There won't be excessive extra funding, that's clear, and that's a matter for the Chancellor on what she wants to allocate to the individual sectors, but there's a number of pressures. But I think our reform programme can lead to more productive, better value for money outcomes for citizens.
Travers made it quite clear that it's not going to save money in the short term.
Which particular aspect?
This local government reform, all these wonderful new things we're going to get, new mayors, new larger combined authorities and so on and so forth.
I mean, if you're talking about reorganisation specifically.
Yes.
So I think that there can be a upfront cost to reorganisation. I think quite quickly you do start to save money. That's the evidence that we have from the reorganisations that happened at the beginning of the 2010s. So Ernst & Young did a report in 2016 that said Wiltshire was saving £18 million a year, Cornwall 17, Durham 22, Shropshire 20. PwC have done a report saying that you could save 2.9 billion over 5 years. So I don't think anyone would say that by having a single layer of local government, not two layers of local government, that savings can't be made. Sometimes there is an investor save case, but we are in this for the medium and long term.
Okay, well, Oz will come back on this, but let's just move on for the moment to Michael to look at homeless.
Thank you, Chair. I think you would accept, as people who work very closely with local government, that a good state relies on having good local government. But I think anybody walking around their local community, seeing their leisure centres closed in recent years, driving on their roads full of potholes, seeing additional litter, walking through their high street where there are high numbers of vacant shops, would say that local government isn't in a great state at the moment, notwithstanding some of the brilliant work that takes place every single day in our local councils from our staff. The government's obviously got some very clear stated objectives around housing, around economic growth. But there's a question for me about how, in your view, can local government make a contribution to those key objectives, the missions that have been set out by the Prime Minister and by government, if they continue to face the immense financial challenges that they face. And let me just pick up one particular instance. If we focus on the mission for the government around housing, specifically talking about local government, spending on immediate homelessness services increased in real terms by 105% from 1.49 billion to 3.06 billion between 15-16 to 23-24, although I must say that most of that increase was to spend on temporary accommodation. Over the exact same period, spending on other housing services, which includes most of the preventative services, fell by 642 million. And so at the moment it feels like we are putting, and I think Professor Tony Travers said this, money into cure or treatment in the way that historically we have been doing in the NHS, but not actually putting money into prevention and tackling the problem before it emerges in society. And I just wondered, as people who work with local government every day and also working across government, both from MHLG and the Treasury, how can local government play its role in delivering these critical missions, which I think local government needs to be playing a lead role in if it's under the immense financial pressure that it is, and if we are shoveling money towards cure rather than prevention in the way that is evidenced in the figures?
Yeah, it's really an issue we really recognise and appreciate. And indeed, one of the answers I gave earlier about giving greater flexibility in the use of grants was precisely about kind of local government being able to identify the best way of stemming demand through better joined up services at an earlier stage. I think that's something we'd like to see more of in future. When it comes to homelessness specifically, as we've discussed in this hearing already, we know that the pressures, particularly on temporary accommodation, are really serious. I appeared in front of this committee in early December specifically to talk about homelessness and some of those pressures. It is the case that as a result of the numbers in temporary accommodation and the requirement to provide temporary accommodation, that councils have seen their expenditure go up on that, and that more of the homelessness prevention grant is being spent on temporary accommodation rather than on preventative services. That is something we would like to see change. We have obviously increased the amount going into the homelessness prevention grant, and alongside doing that we've specifically taken an approach which in the rest of this hearing I've sort of described as being something we try to avoid, which is to ring fence a proportion of that for preventative spend, precisely just to try and shift this so that there is some management of demand, because the pressures have been so great and because the outcomes for citizens of being in temporary accommodation are not good. You know, that is not a good situation. It is not one that we want to see, particularly for families and children. And since I first started, looking at this really closely, we've gone from 146,000 children in temporary accommodation to over 160,000, which is, a huge increase by itself in a very, very short space of time. So you are absolutely right to highlight the need for greater preventative spend. We are also keen to look at how we can improve the consistency of the effect of that preventative spend across local areas, because obviously some councils will do this better than others and be predicting their temporary accommodation pipeline and intervening earlier better than others. So keen to support learning between areas of local government. And then separately on homelessness, as I said before, it's not straightforward, but one intervention that has been well received by councils, we've got really good feedback, is the Local Authority Housing Fund, in terms of being able to bring properties back into use for temporary accommodation or for rent for social rent, in order to address some of these pressures. In the long term, this is a supply issue. We know that there are major crisis is the same word that our ministers have used with regard to housing as well as with local government. Crisis in housing supply, and the Deputy Prime Minister and the Housing and Planning Minister have been absolutely clear that they want a significant proportion of the 1.5 million homes to be social and affordable housing, precisely because of the issues that you've articulated.
Conrad, is there a thank you, Sarah, that's very helpful. Is there a recognition from the Treasury about the crucial role that local government plays in delivering government's missions? Because, and I declared an interest in the previous session, as somebody who spent 14 years deputy leader of the council responsible for finance, county councillor, you know, under successive governments, it seems to me that every time we come round to a spending review, notwithstanding the good work of ministers and our officials here at MHCLG, there's a risk that it's kind of bottom of the pile and that other departments are seen as more important. The NHS comes first, or policing comes first. Or is there a recognition from the Treasury, given what's been said by Sarah and her colleagues this time round in the spending review, that if the government is going to meet these critical 5 missions that the Prime Minister set out, that these good colleagues here from MHCLG have got to get the requisite funding they need from the Treasury to deliver on those missions?
I mean, I think there absolutely is a recognition both of the extremely difficult financial situation in local government and of the importance of local government for the whole range of the government's missions, whether they be housing or economic growth or health or all of those things. I mean, I'd say a couple of things about that. I think it is, notable that of the priority reforms that we set out in the first phase of the spending review, what we wanted the second phase of the spending review to focus on. They cover all 4 of the main drivers of the financial situation in local governments and children's social care, adult social care, homelessness. They also cover the broader local government finance reform that we're talking about. And indeed, the bigger reform to the overall spending framework that we have made to move back to multi-year settlements and allow that kind of planning over a longer period is also there to support what I think everybody recognises has got to be a kind of a longer term shift from downstream to upstream into prevention. That takes time, and you do it gradually, not just in local government. That's also the picture that you're looking at in health. I guess that the last thing I'd say is spending is an important part of this, but it's by no means the only important part of this, and a place where local government plays a huge role. So one really important thing is the planning reforms that MHCLG have been putting through, and which in the spring statement a week or two ago, the OBR recognised would increase the size of the economy by, I think, around £7 billion by the end of 29-30. Those sorts of things, which are not spending their regulatory decisions, also have a huge impact and allow that sort of positive, self-reinforcing reinvestment that the government is trying to deliver.
Just finally, if I may, that's really helpful, Conrad. I think historically, the Heseltine report pointed out on this, that central government tends to be focused on function rather than place. And if I may, without being critical of the Treasury, I think the Treasury's probably come in for criticism for that historically. Do you recognise that there's a need to shift from just looking at function more to place, and recognise that, for places like mine and other colleagues who are represented on the committee, pride of place, a sense of pride in where you live, a sense of local government playing a role in making sure that the communities around the country, all parts of the country, are thriving, are a nice place to live, socialise and work, are important, and that central government departments need to look a little bit more at place rather than just focusing on function in a way that maybe historically they have.
No, I think I absolutely agree with that. Will might want to add on this. He's far more expert than me. But the shift to integrated settlements for mayors, allowing a much more closer to the local area set of decision making on what is going to work best for that place, is something that the Treasury is absolutely very supportive of, and trying to facilitate through this spending review.
So I did 16 years in the Treasury before I came to MHCLG, and to be fair to the Treasury, it has championed the mayoral devolution agenda since 2014, and as Conrad said, one of the biggest reforms that we are making, which I am convinced can get better outcomes, lead to better value for money, and more efficient public spending, is the integrated settlement that we're doing for mayoral combined authorities. That effectively takes housing money, local growth money, adult education budget, retrofit, and DFT capital, puts it into a combined settlement and allows it to be spent on the place, and money to be via between those pots to transfer from one year to another, capital to revenue switches. So you don't start to think about the transport project in isolation from the housing development, in isolation from where the FE college is going to be constructed, in isolation from where you're retrofitting homes, you can start to integrate those things. So I think we're making big progress. The first integrated settlement was launched just this week for Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. It's coming down the road next year for the North East, for South Yorkshire, for West Yorkshire and Liverpool City region. Mayors are very keen that they want more of this, and it is a way of forcing place-based thinking into government. So it's a big change.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Secretary, can I just take up one thing you said in answer to Michael Payne? And I think before I ask this question, I should now declare my registered member's interest as a chartered surveyor. Given that you're planning an infrastructure bill is going to take more control over local plans, you want to deliver more social housing. If you want to deliver more social housing in that 1.5 million, where is the money coming from to do that?
I mean, I should just say that I'm sure my housing and planning colleagues would want me to say it only takes control over local plans where local areas haven't produced local plans, and it has set ambitious targets, but I think that is all about saying we have a crisis in housing in the country and we need to address that. When it comes to, is your question about funding specifically?
Well, if you want, you said that within, quite reasonably, I'm not criticising, that you want to produce more social housing, so the ratio is going to go up in terms of that 1.5 million. How are we going to do that? Where's the funding going to come from?
Well, I mean, as I've already sort of championed a few times in this hearing already, kind of the sort of commitment to a future affordable homes programme absolutely includes a commitment to social housing, and as part of that, and is, you know, been a very successful programme that we've been spending extremely well our budgets on it in recent years, and that is about, you know, I don't know what the final settlement will be in the spending review, but we've currently got an extension of it for next year of 2 billion, so confirmed already, so we can start getting on with plans.
Well, I'm not sure that we've actually delivered the number of social houses we need. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the problems. That
I didn't say we'd deliver the number of social houses we need. I said
we've
we've been spending the budget that we'd receive, and it has been delivering housing. But obviously, we want to continue to see it do that.
Right, I'm going to hand over to if you want to follow that, Clive.
Sorry, I'm just sort of almost listening with amazement there, Permanent Secretary. Yeah, we convolute the terms, don't we? Social housing and affordable housing. The vast majority of affordable housing programs have been spent on shared ownership for the last few years, hasn't it? That's the reality.
But ministers have set out an ambition for the future on affordable homes, and so if you're asking, the original question from the chair was specifically about kind of where is the money going to come from for the future investment in this, and I was explaining that is where the money will come from for the future investment in it.
It's clear, isn't it, that the government's ambition is 1.5 million homes over the course of the Parliament. Nowhere have we seen a clear plan as to how those houses are going to be built, in what tenure, by what organisations, and how they're going to be paid for. That's not been set out, has it?
I'd absolutely love to come back and do a sort of full hearing on housing for you to talk you through, but we are producing a long-term housing strategy to run alongside the spending review, which will set out the fact that we believe in order to meet the 1.5 million homes target, as the Housing Minister has said, we need to take action across everything. Planning, as Conrad mentioned earlier, but also the funding of those homes, the approach to design, quality, and take all of that into account together.
We could probably pick that up on another occasion then in detail. Right, moving on. I just say to Mr. Garton, I can't resist again. Yeah, it's great, the single pot funding for mayoral combined authorities. Just point out the pace at which things operate. First Combined Authority in Manchester has been in operation for 10 years? It's taken 10 years from the authority being set up to actually getting the single pot. It's not very quick, is it, the process?
Well, the intention for the integrated settlement...
Just say yes. That's all right.
No, sorry. The integrated settlement, the previous administration announced a single settlement in the Trailblazer deal with Greater Manchester I'm going to go for November 23, is my recollection. So actually, I think the right barometer is not from when the deal was first struck, which was 2014. I don't think it was a mayor until 2016. The right barometer is when the government policy was announced, which was certainly in 2023. I think it was November, and it's up and running So that was part way through that financial year, and it's up and running by April 26th. So yeah, I do think that's quite quick.
Yeah. Well, right. So the departments were quite quick. The politicians weren't very quick. That's probably the
policy decision. Four ministers.
Yeah. Right.
They made a policy decision in April 23, and we implemented it. That is how this, as you know, that's how the system works. And so
can I go back to the national insurance changes, which you kindly answered some questions on earlier. I'm told the local government association has done some calculations where they say the costs of the national insurance increases directly to local governments been 550 million. There's been 637 million, but the amount of money local governments got to compensate is 550 million. So 550 million to compensate for a cost of 637 million. But then there's indirect costs to the private sector providers to local government of 1.1 billion. So whatever local councils try and square it, whatever they do, there's a shortfall of over £1 billion, according to the LGA.
I think that comes back to we look at all those things in the round as part of the whole settlement, and as part of the absolutely recognising that you asked the question before about the places in your constituency, absolutely recognising that it is difficult for some of those places, but in the round, through both the spending review and the local government finance settlement, we put in 5 billion of extra grant. We tried to do that in a way that, as Will and Sarah has said, that is consistent with where we want to move in the future, so fewer ring fences, greater flexibility for local government, and I think and that led to a kind of significant uplift in core spending power, a real terms increase for the vast majority of the sector.
Are the LGA's figures wrong?
I think
LGA's figures.
The LGA's figures. I mean,
we haven't critiqued them or done our own assessment of whether the LGA are right or wrong.
Well, and I therefore ask Permanent Secretary, perhaps if you think the LGA figures are wrong, could you write to the committee with what you think the true figure is?
Well, we can write to you and set out the approach that we've taken to NIC's funding.
Yes, that would be really helpful. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just move on now to wider issues and probably even bigger challenges? The statutory override's been in place now for a few years. It's coming to an end at the end of this year, apparently. Well, that's the policy currently. So what are you doing with your colleagues in DFE to decide what is going to happen once the override comes to an end?
Nico's our resident expert on this one.
Absolutely. As Sarah said, I mean, there is a huge amount of work going on in government at the moment on special educational needs funding and specifically on the statutory override. I think we in government absolutely recognise the figures in the NAO report about the size of the deficit, about the impact that would have on quite a large number of local authorities if the override was to end in March 26. And so the plans and the conversations that we're having, which are very live, and we will set out more detail as part of the spending review and at the provisional local government settlement in the autumn, we'll have to have a plan for looking both at SEND, and I think the Secretary of State for Education has been clear that kind of on SEND specifically, all options are on the table, that there is a desire to increase kind of mainstream delivery of SEND and make it more inclusive in part of the whole school system. And as part of that transition plan and the transition, we are working on plans around the DSG deficits. But we are absolutely clear that there needs to be a plan both on SEND and for the deficits, and we're working hand in glove with Conrad and his teams.
I mean, I agree with that. The only thing I would add is like the important issue is the underlying spending pressure. That is central to the discussions in the spending review, and there are very live discussions on how the pressure should be managed, what reforms should be undertaken. The spending review as a whole covers both DEL spending and annually managed expenditure. The statutory override in place in 25-26 effectively comes through in the OBR forecast as increased annually managed expenditure. So we look at both of those things together. The key point and what the spending review is aiming to do is set out a sustainable position for local government as a whole and special educational needs funding within that over the whole period of the spending review.
Right, so it's going to be incorporated into the general local government settlement going forward, how do you deal with the historic deficits then? Because either those councils are going to have that lead weight, which you're going to have to deal with somehow, or you're going to write them off, in which case if you write them off, then councils that never had the deficit go and say, wait a minute, they've just been given a funding bonus that we've never had.
I mean, we're working through all options at the moment. I mean, we can't say more because we haven't taken a policy decision as part of that, but we are looking at all options in the deficits. Absolutely recognise some of the issues that you've set out, and I think we'll set out more detail as part of the spending review and then as part of the local government finance settlement.
So you're going to be looking at what happens going forward with the overall spending, but also how you deal with the specific legacy that you...
Absolutely, for the reasons set out in the NAO report. If we did one, not the other, we don't think it would be a good outcome for local government.
So just moving on to the finance reforms that we're going to see. I mean, I suppose local government may still be a bit sceptical. We've had over the last few years a fair funding review, which never quite happened. We've had business rate reform, which still hasn't really happened. We've had promises from the previous Secretary of State, Michael Gove, about council tax reform, and then that was sort of backtracked on after he called it a regressive tax, and then everyone decided there was not a review taking place of it. So we've been through quite a few different proposals for reform, and nothing's really happened. So can we be certain we are going to get some fundamental reforms this time?
Yes. We've consulted on them and we've started them, as we've already said, in the way that we distributed last year's settlement, and so...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think my team would be terrified if I told them now that we were not going to do it, given how hard they're working to get everything ready. We don't have a choice.
We don't have a choice. The ministers have been absolutely clear about that.
Yeah, because of we all understand, we're all saying the same thing about how difficult it is for local authorities right now. There is no choice but to do reform.
Yeah. And we're having a huge number of conversations, very helpful conversations with the sector. We've gone through all the first consultation responses, and we are working with ministers very quickly alongside the spending review to finalise policy decisions to allow us to consult in June.
Obviously, it's up to ministers exactly what the shape of that is,
of course, yes.
But the fact that reform is coming is absolutely clear.
So these reforms that are going to be looked at as part of an overall package, yes. Reforms to how money is distributed alone, or to how money is raised as well?
I mean, I think as we set out in our first consultation, if you look at the different chapters, primarily the things we've consulted on already are around how we get a better assessment of need within the sector, which is all the stuff we discussed about already with out-of-date formulas and updating all of them. And then, as you say, how we distribute the funding, how we take account of the differing ability of places to raise income themselves and make sure that we are doing that in an up-to-date fashion. We did also ask some questions in the first consultation about particularly sales fees and charges, and we had some interesting choices around that. We've already set out in terms of income some possible things around second homes and empty homes, and a number of responses to that consultation also came up with a number of other suggestions. For instance, I know amongst the sector that a tourism tax is a thing they are particularly interested in.
These are relatively small revenue generators, though, in the end. I mean, apart from the government grant, which obviously you're looking at how that's going to be distributed. So the big potential income earners for local authorities are council tax. Is that on the agenda for discussion as part of the reforms?
I think ministers have been clear that they are not going to undertake a fundamental revaluation of council tax at this time.
Right. So no changes for council tax.
Well, they have been very clear they're not going to undertake a fundamental revaluation.
Because that's a Treasury responsibility, isn't it?
I mean, we've already taken through, Chief Roller sent yesterday a kind of first bill on non-domestic rates, and that did introduce some changes. I think that was quite a significant set of reforms. I think we have been clear that insofar as business rates relates to the local government finance settlement, obviously there's a very close interaction. A key part of our funding reforms is to undertake a business rates reset. And we think that once you have undertaken a business rates reset, that is key to the distributional reforms, rather like some of the questions we were answering about kind of further, more fundamental reforms, they are all decisions for ministers once we've undertaken the business rates reset and done the redistribution reforms.
I mean, that's a reset within the existing framework.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's not a change.
Well, I think it hasn't been done since 2013-14.
On the tax itself, and I'm not an expert on this, is another bit of the Treasury's responsibility, but my understanding is that there is a sort of discussion paper out on priority areas for future reform of business rates. There's a manifesto commitment on for 26-27, shifting the balance of business rates to away from rateable properties with a rateable value below 500,000 paid for with ones above 500,000. But I think the kind of question you're asking is more about that discussion paper on future reform, but I don't have more than that.
Will so as Clive says, this is a reform within the existing system, but the second phase of that, I think I was hearing, Nico, is that there will be a consultation on how much is actually retained by local government and how much is retained by national government. Am I hearing that?
So I think there are two things. I think Conrad has alluded to the discussion paper which is out, which is more about kind of reforming the kind of central running of the tax. The thing that we will cover in our consultation in June is resetting the 50% retention that the sector has.
Thank you. So when all this is done, just Sarah Healey, you're already sleeping very comfortably at night, we understand. So will you be able to sleep even more comfortably? You think these reforms in the end are going to put local government finance on a sustainable footing?
I think they will significantly improve the position of local government, yes.
Politician's answer from an official. I mean, that's you can't.
No, I think. Look,
yeah,
I mean, I don't know what you want me to say in response to that question.
You say
what
yes.
I can absolutely say is, we think we're doing the right things to reform local government finance. We have thought about it very, very, very hard. There are always things that can change in the context that can surprise you. And I think that has been true over the last few years. We would not have expected or anticipated some of the pressures that have arisen in some areas. So trying to get me to kind of say to you everything is going to be fine and there won't be any issues when I can't foresee all of that context, I'm not going to say. Do I think, we don't know the outcome of the spending review, do I think that, we've just had major international kind of turmoil already kind of affecting the overall economic position. So I just want to be clear, kind of, I think we are doing absolutely the right things in order to put local government onto sustainable future footing.
Thank you. Oliver Ryan.
Thank you. Just to follow up to that, what's the timing and sequencing of the funding reform, local government reorganisation, local audit reform, service reform, and some of the reforms you've talked about in council tax and business rates? How does that sequence?
All happening at once.
Yeah, I think, and I've said this a lot to the sector, and Will, you might want to come in on reorganisation, but reorganisation, we have proposals in from the sector at the moment. We are in the stage of beginning to give feedback to some of those. In June, we will consult on the funding reforms, the redistribution, the formulas. Local authorities will have as I said, a good idea of the direction of travel in those reforms in June. That will be informed by the spending review outcome, and as Sarah said before, will include detail around transitional protections and that sort of stuff. Then, coming out of the spending review, I think we all very much hope that we'll be able to provide much more clarity on children's social care reform, on homelessness and temporary accommodation, on the SEND conversation, including the DSG deficits. That will then feed into a local government finance settlement, provisional. Everyone is asking me, will it be before December? To which the answer is, we hope so, but not much by December, because once you've done the consultation responses back in June and then taken a final set of decisions, so it will be sort of late November, I would have thought. That will set out a funding settlement, we very much hope, over 3 years. That will be the first multi-year settlement for a decade. It will also set out how the kind of the funding consequences of some of those reforms to the high cost areas, and then we will also have local government reorganisation. But I think the way we probably think about it is that the local government reorganisation is on a timeline whereby we will not factor that into the multi-year settlement in setting out in kind of late November, early December, because those decisions both locally and nationally will not have been taken by that time.
some of this stuff, is huge. How confident are you that you've got the capacity within the department to run all of this at the same time and get it done to a high enough standard? And I suppose on the local government reorganisation point, I know there are sort of time windows that are already set out, but why can't we do that faster in areas that are up for it?
I'll say something and then I'll hand over to Will. I mean, in terms of capacity in the department, it is my responsibility to make sure that we have the resources where they need to be. And clearly we have a lot going on in terms of housing reform and planning reform as well as local government reform, but I am confident that so far we've made the right decisions to put people into the right places, but we always keep that under review, listen to feedback from local government that we're working with, whether they're getting the service that they want and need, and we will continue to keep that under review.
Why can't we do it? Our objective, our aim is to have the process of local government reorganisation with new authorities going live by April 28. That is them as formally legally constituted bodies. What often happens in practice from previous experiences is they start to operate in shadow form well before then. It is a mix of the statutory process consultations that we need to undertake, and we also just need to make sure that we get this right. As we've articulated already in this hearing, this is a big deal, and there is just a trade-off between speed, and there's just a risk if you go too fast that we'll start to get some of it wrong.
Well, if you need to do one particularly quickly, Lancashire. You let us know.
Surrey is first on our list, but
have a look at Lancashire as well.
Okay. Just to follow that question, would you expect elections in shadow form to be in 2027 or actual form in 2028?
I think the first thing to say is that elections have been postponed by 1 year only, so we'll have any elections that were postponed from May 2025 will be held in May 2026. I think it depends. There's a slightly different timetable for Surrey, so I would just want to check with my I can write to you and give you an answer.
Very happy to write to us, because I think this is really important. There will be a lot of interest in the answer to that question. Right, Anna Dixon, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. So thinking really now about some of the sort of longer term, obviously this is a major reform. It's really important that there's then stability in how this then beds in, given the sort of transition. We've recognised in parallel there are other reform discussions going on. I want to just pick up one in particular, which is the Casey review of adult social care, which is looking at a national care service. Now, the terms of reference have not yet been released for that, but what we do know is that there is a sort of first stage of reporting in 2026 for sort of medium term, and then 2028 for the longer term. Given that both in the Fabian Society report, which was done pre-election, feeding into the government on the sort of national care service idea, and also in Scotland, in both there were very, very significant possible changes to both the role of local authorities in both the funding, commissioning and delivery of adult social care. How are you going to ensure that your sort of reforms to local government finance are going to sort of, one, be resilient for the long term, but also recognise that there could be, in fairly, in 2026 or at least in 2028, some further very fundamental reforms that would impact some, depending on the council, but quite a significant proportion of local government funding?
I mean, I think we speak to the Department of Health the whole time. We are engaging very closely with the Casey team. One of our very treasured former colleagues who used to work very closely with me is now running that review on behalf, for Louise, working to Louise on that. So that is fantastic, because she has excellent experience of local government and means that local government will be at the heart of the thinking on that. I think the timing probably works in the sense that we will be setting out the reforms to our finance system from April next year. That will take 3 years to kind of fully bed in, as Sarah said, but the kind of Casey report, as you exactly say, is reporting in 26 for a first stage and then 28 for a second stage, and so as is the way with these things, it's unlikely that the kind of fundamental changes happen. But as I said beforehand, we think it is really important that before you consider any of the very interesting and big reports, and we've obviously read and found interest in the kind of Fabian report and various things, you need a kind of more stable footing in local government. So I think it is right that our reforms give greater stability, as Sarah has said, and then whatever the kind of Casey review ends up recommending can build off that, I think.
So you're reassuring that the timelines for those are able to match, and that your plans will accommodate any proposals coming out of that review?
I mean, you know, if yes, I think is the answer. I think the plans that we set out may need to be adapted depending on the exact form of the recommendations from the Casey review.
And one of the other joins up, obviously, is between health and social care budgets locally, and we received evidence from the NHS Confederation, which is sort of expressing frustrations that, particularly around the Better Care Fund, those sort of pooled allocations are often coming out late, not joining up between when local government hear about their funding and the NHS, and that was something that was also raised in one of the previous committees here. So how are you working to ensure that, again, as you set longer term multi-year allocations, that the local government and the NHS are being able to sort of plan jointly on critical areas covered by things like the Better Care Fund? Is that again for you?
Yeah, I mean, recognise that. Obviously, I am one of 3 accountable kind of senior reporting officers for the Better Care Fund, alongside a colleague in the Department of Health and a colleague in NHS England, so we work incredibly closely on that. I recognise that in previous years some of that planning guidance has issued late, but for 25-26 we produced the guidance I think in early January. I think it may have been February, but earlier than in previous years, and I think, you know, in the future that kind of integrated pooled budget model is something that we probably want to see more of.
Yes,
just to add on this,
30th of January. I was just about right, 30th of January.
Just to add on this, I mean, one of the underlying reasons why that NHS planning guidance has not been timely has been that the spending framework to date has been much too hand to mouth, with, you know, 1-year extensions, and it was not ideal that the spending review for 25-26 had to take place in November last year, because the previous government took a decision to delay the spending review until after the election. What we have now is a system where we are planning, 4 years in advance, and the spending review is in June. So that should make a significant difference to the ability to do the kind of post-spending review join-up that is important.
And we've heard a lot about local government hopefully having less of these sort of ring-fence pots of money and greater flexibility. Will you be extending such flexibilities to allow greater pooling of budgets and allocating resources between health and care in the way that the NHS Confederation here
Well, I'm not familiar with the specific proposals they're making there, but
I mean, extending the flexibilities around things like the Better Care Fund.
As a general principle, we're very supportive of using these kind of mechanisms that can allow better join up between different parts of the system. And one of the things that we're doing differently in the spending review this time round is to focus it much more around the government's missions, which are of course all very cross-departmental, and the health mission, which involves both the Department of Health and Social Care and local government and many others. The process that we have been following has been allowing much more of a discussion between departments at an earlier stage in the spending review. So that kind of thing, in principle, we're very much in favour of.
Just one last thing. We've talked so much about demand-led and statutory services, but almost nothing about the very important discretionary services that make a huge difference to my residents' sort of day-to-day quality of life, whether that's parks, arts and culture, library services, waste management. In a local government, the NEO report states that local government information unit from their recent finance survey suggested that as many as a third of councils are planning cuts in all of these areas. I just wondered if sort of in order to preserve some of these services, obviously you take something like potholes, the DFT are choosing to ring fence pothole funding and indeed require quite a lot of detailed information being provided by local government. So all very well having greater flexibility, but do other government departments, buy into that? And if we've got this example of the DFT sort of wanting to make sure, because otherwise, if that money just goes into the general local government pot, it will get absorbed by statutory services, and these very important day-to-day but so-called discretionary services just will continue to get cut.
So I think, I'll let others come in on the detail of the potholes issue, but I think, to be honest, I think Council's done an amazing job of sustaining spending on some of those critical services. As a former permanent secretary at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, I recognise the absolutely huge value in leisure, recreational, arts and culture activities in libraries, for the sort of for pride in place, for for sort of a sense of community and the sort of significance of those things for sort of healthy communities and lives. So I think they've actually done a really fantastic job of that. Do I think the answer to the fact that local government has been squeezed on funding is to give them more duties and more forms to fill in for central government? In principle, no.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we set out a very clear ambition here. We are I think it's fair to say that historically we may not have always had the best grip on how many grants there are outside of the local government finance settlement. I think I can reassure you that has changed. There is a team in our department working very closely on that with Conrad's team, meeting with all departments, and I think we will make good progress. We already consolidated, I think, between 5 or 10 grants into the 25-26 settlement, and I'm sure there will be more to come. Specifically on your question about the I know you weren't implying this, but I think when you speak to local authorities, they find the sort of statutory versus non-statutory a bit of a binary thing for the reasons that you're suggesting, which is that at a local level, culture, art, things is so important to actually preventing some of the things that we want. So I would also just make the point that our funding reforms are absolutely key on this. When you look at every outcome, whether it is potholes or culture spend or whatever, that the outcomes are less good in places that have traditionally received less money. It's not the world's most surprising thing, and that places that have had more money have, for very sensible reasons, taken the decision to maintain those sorts of services and maintain spending on prevention, and shifting what will end up being quite a significant amount of money to places that are less able to raise revenue locally, I think will give greater flexibility and the ability to maintain some of those key non-statutory services.
And so just on the point about sort of data requests back to central government, other government departments, I'm brilliant that the government have given extra money for potholes. It is an issue that my constituents are concerned about. But is this basically because they haven't had a grip on what the condition of roads are previously, and how are you going to continue to coordinate and make sure that there isn't a bureaucratic sort of burden on local authorities to be accounting for all sorts of individual things?
I think there will always be some areas of spend which are very important, either to residents or very important politically, and I think potholes is possibly one of those things. I think as a general rule, I think our expectation is that, and certainly how we have begun to do it in the settlement this year, is giving local authorities greater discretion over more money, having fewer sort of micro controls and fewer reporting requirements. We're not complete. I'm a real advocate of this and probably irritate lots of people all around Whitehall. But even I accept that there will still be the cases where you need some ring fences and some reporting requirements, as Sarah said, particularly around prevention spending. But I think the general, I really hope, and I think you will expect to see the general shift coming out of the spending review into 26-27.
And I think somebody has to push back when the ministers
we do.
Come
so at official level, we absolutely have really robust conversations with colleagues about wrapping in grants. I think I would definitely not take the view that they just haven't understood. From their perspective, they've got a set of accountabilities where they end up in front of committees that ask them questions about why they haven't delivered X, Y and Z, and they can point to an amount of money they put in, but not necessarily to the leverage they have on how it comes out. And therefore I fully understand why they might go for for a mechanism here which is about ring fencing or grant requirements or other things. It is beholden on us, actually, and ministers have set out how they would like to sort of pursue this, to set out a proper performance framework for local government that gives my colleagues confidence that actually if they do wrap in these funds, they will nevertheless, without it becoming overly onerous for local government, be able to judge overall broad performance without necessarily needing reporting on every last micro detail.
So I just point out the slight paradox between that response and the response earlier when we were talking about adult social care and the Market Sustainability Improvement Fund, where the view was, no, we can't tell them, we can't ask them, it's just entirely up to local government. So we're scrutinising the spending on potholes, but actually we don't know whether this adult social care sector is about to fall over or not.
So without commenting on potholes at all, it's about outcomes rather than inputs, I think, is the difference. So we're moving to an outcomes-based performance framework.
Say the point, I think there needs to be consistency across government departments and across the areas of spend, that there is appropriate levels of accountability and assessment to give that reassurance nationally, whilst recognising that there is a local accountability and that there is some consistency across that in future.
Just add specifically on, and I made this point before, so sorry I didn't make it clearly enough, but the Market Sustainability and Improvement Fund, which is the £1 billion fund which I referred to earlier, specifically around the adult social care market, does have requirements around that, around reporting, around evidence and transparency. So I think I take your general point, but I think on that specific example there is more data that we gather on it.
And would the local audit office in future have a role in supporting this? In terms of both transparency on what's being spent and what the outcomes are being delivered?
Specifically on adult social care?
No, I'm meaning in general about this idea of having an accountability framework and having data that can give some assurance back as to what outcomes are being delivered for what spend.
No, I think sort of policy decisions on that part of the remit are still to be made, but that is definitely a possibility. We want to agree, as Sarah's articulated, a simple, accessible outcomes framework for local government by which have a number of metrics below them from which we can judge performance. We want to get the right balance between that not being too onerous and hundreds of forms being filled in, while still ensuring that there is accountability to government and accountability to Parliament. That we're working up that now. We will say more on it in due course, but that is the sweet spot that we are aiming for.
Thank you very much.
I just must pick you up on that answer, Will Garton. You said gathering more data so that we know what we're getting for our money, and there was a key recommendation in our roads report. We simply didn't know what the state of our roads was for the amount of money that we're spending. Surely it is absolutely essential in delivering government services that we have the data so we know whether we're getting the value for money for the money that we're giving to each service.
What I said was we are looking at trying to agree for the finance assessment a set of outcomes rather than inputs, and below those outcomes a number of metrics by which the outcome can be judged. So that will invariably include and be informed by data. I think there is a legitimate question as to quite how much data we require of the sector currently. The department isn't doing this anymore, but when I first joined it, we had 400 different metrics for the various local growth funds. I'm not actually sure that we got a better picture on local growth funds as a result of those 400 metrics. There were too many. We've had a big effort to try and consolidate and reduce and move to an outcomes-based framework. So there is a trade-off between flexibility and autonomy locally and the amount of prescription and detail that central government can demand of local government. Right now, I think in various parts we are, as Sarah and Nico have said, we are moving in a direction of trying to measure outcomes, not specific inputs. So, for example, on the sort of high street regeneration funds, we have discussed, I think, in this committee before, that one of the questions we asked was how many metres of high street have you regenerated? Which in one sense sounds like a perfectly sensible question, but it's not apparent to me, having looked at it, that 50 is better than 40. I don't know that. I can't tell that from the data. So we've got to be careful that we get the balance right and look at the overall health of a high street, not just a sort of narrow set of metrics that don't actually tell us very much.
And just to build on that, I think it's back to the point that we've made about measuring the 70 billion, because what I think we've probably been guilty of as a kind of government over successive times is measuring the specific input. So we measure a 1 billion grant on adult social care. Local government spends 26 billion on adult social care, and we've not necessarily been measuring the whole of that. So the outcomes framework is about measuring the full amount of the 70 billion, trying to bring in even more funding into that 70 billion from the hundreds of grants outside of the funding settlement, and doing it in an outcomes way, as Will suggests.
I'm not sure that I'm totally convinced by these answers, but we will look at the transcript fairly carefully and see what we need to recommend in our report. Michael, Payne,
Thank you, Chair. We touched a little bit on prevention earlier, and Nico, I think you've just been talking about it a bit more, but the NHS, spending on the NHS since 2016-17, up 20% real terms to 23-24. Spending on public health, largely prevention, down over 10% in real terms over the exact same period. So if you just take that as an example, a question to you, Conrad, and I guess Sarah, Nico and Will to follow on, how is the spending review going to support a shift specifically to prevention and support for prevention? And then as a flow on from the spending review then into MHCLG, how is MHCLG in the next local government finance settlement coming up going to actually incentivise prevention? Because your local government finance policy statement, I think in November 2024, had a very specific commitment about the need to shift to prevention in order to tackle some of the failure in services. So what will we see in real terms of a shift to that?
First thing I should say on prevention in particular is that it's not just about spending, and there's a very important role for both regulation and tax in that. So if you're thinking about the health space, things like regulation on smoking and creating a smoke-free generation, soft drinks industry levy, those sorts of things are very important too. But on spending particularly, so making that shift from downstream to upstream prevention is a big part of what we're trying to do in this spending review. In particular, I suppose I'd pick out three things. The first is the multi-year element of it. That's a sine qua non of doing this sensibly, because you need to be able to have the incentives in place that you make savings with investment up front, down the line. So that I think is a very important part of it. Secondly, you need kind of prioritisation and focus on those policies which are going to pay dividends in future years. And as I think I said before, a large number of the kind of crucial reforms that we're trying to focus on in the spending review have that shift to prevention at the heart of it. We've already talked about the local government ones, but the health 10-year plan, that shift from treatment to prevention is going to be central to that. And then the third thing I would just say is you do need to set aside some funding up front to try and ease that. You have this acute trade-off between treating the symptoms, which you've got to carry on doing, and making some more investment in dealing with the causes. One of the things the Chancellor announced in the spring statement was a £3.25 billion transformation fund, which will be looking at all of the ways you can invest to save. So that's kind of digital investment and things to make government more efficient, but it is also thinking about investing up front to make that shift to prevention, which can save money in the later years of the spending review. So that's how we're approaching it in general.
And this, specifically on the funding, how do we, notwithstanding what happens in the spending review, how do you translate that? I think, we, as Sarah said before, we've already begun to do that in 25-26 by specifically putting ring-fence funding into the homelessness prevention grant and increasing that. We've introduced a new grant, which is the Children's Social Care Prevention Grant. So as Conrad was suggesting, there is always a trade-off between dealing with what you have in front of you in terms of service demand and kind of shifting to prevention. But I think there is pretty compelling evidence, particularly around children's social care and homelessness and temporary accommodation, that in the payback periods, both the outcomes for people and the payback periods are pretty quick, and so I would expect us to try and continue that sort of approach.
And I would say as well that at this point about pooling funding, so being able to pool funding makes a real difference here, because you talked earlier about place. We in MHCLG like to try and think of everything in terms of place, and when you visit places, what you see is that if you have services that for whatever reason to do with the way that they're funded or established kind of can't join up with each other, you tend to see worse outcomes than when you can sort of do things in a sort of collective way downstream. And I sort of think kind of what we're doing on the flexibility of funding there is really important to it, without wanting in any way, shape or form to return to the now highly controversial topic of the local government outcomes framework. If we choose the right performance measures and metrics for that, it should also incentivise a move towards not kind of the numbers that you're sort of addressing in a crisis fashion, but rather kind of, are you seeing those outcomes for citizens improving over time?
One final question, if I may, Chair, to Sarah. Each year in the Provisional Local Government Finance Settlement, there's an envelope set out by the Minister, and then there's a consultation period, and obviously each government department holds consultations. Your government department, though, the trust and the partnership between you and local government really matters, and listening to people in that consultation and the evidence they provide matters. I just wonder, year on year, how much of that contingency is ever used in terms of actually listening to what people say in a consultation period, taking that genuinely on board, and then I accept this is a ministerial decision, but advised by officials, whether ministers then actually make a decision when it comes to the final provisional finance settlement being confirmed. It's confirmed here in Parliament, obviously, by the Minister. What tweaks and changes? Are there often tweaks and changes made? Is the contingency...
The answer to that is yes.
And could you perhaps write to us and share some examples?
I think we've already used one. We've already used one in this hearing about national insurance contributions and the distribution of that funding.
Yeah, and I mean,
Nico can give you some more.
Yes, exactly.
It'd be helpful to see some examples.
Well, we can talk you through some now.
I mean, I can talk you through some now. So, I mean, I'm going to get my financial years in 24-25 financial year. I think between the provisional and the final, ministers took a decision to increase the rural service delivery grant. Also, I think in 24-25, in between the provisional and the final, we announced additional funding for adult social... Well, additional funding, 500 million of which was for adult social care. We have made tweaks this year, as Sarah said, as a result of national insurance. So I think absolutely that process is invaluable. We also, throughout the consultation, hold a series of meetings with our sort of group of trusted treasurers, which are the representative groups of districts and counties and unitaries and etc. So yeah, I think it is a proper consultation process, and we are certainly reflecting on and making tweaks to our approach based on the consultation document on the funding reform that we put out alongside the provisional settlement, and it will certainly be the case that the one we publish in June will be all the better for the excellent engagement we have with the sector.
Any more questions? So I've just got one really, really big one, I think, to finish with, Permanent Secretary, really, and I want to get this on the record, so I'm going to read it out, the whole of paragraph 3.38 on page 58, just to really put on the record how serious the whole situation is. DFE recognises that the immediate action is needed to address short-term financial challenges of the accumulated deficit. This is in relation to SEND. Which under its central estimate will be 4.6 billion by March 2026. It also estimates that 50% of local authorities, 33%, will have cumulative deficits larger than their reserves at the end of 25-6, with a further 10% estimated needing to spend 75% of their reserves to clear their deficits. Some 43% of local authorities may therefore be at risk of needing to issue a Section 114 report if the statutory override ends as planned on March 26. I mean, this is a really serious situation that local authorities are in. And I've listened carefully to everything you've all said this morning, all the consultations, all the proposed reforms you're going to make, but how much worse is this local government sector going to have to get before it gets better?
Well, our aim is not.
Your aim may be that, but it is such a big problem, and you've got so much on your plate at the moment. I really fear for the local government sector.
I mean, we obviously are extremely, I mean, I hope you've got a sense of just how sort of knowledgeable and kind of also how focused we are on some of these
I get that,
problems.
and I don't pretend it's
We've
easy.
obviously in the process of a spending review. It's hard to say exactly kind of what position we would be in a year's time, but we think we're doing the right reform to address the really fundamental issues, which, I mean, that paragraph is a great example of, both in MHCLG in partnership with our colleagues at the Treasury that we work very closely with, and also with other colleagues around government.
So I suppose the analogy I have in my head is this, that local government, various local authorities are the nuts and bolts of local government. A lot of them are rusting through, they're about to bust. On top of that, you then want to build a new building, an entirely new building of local government reorganisation with those rusted through nuts and bolts. My worry is that the whole thing is going to collapse. Am I being too pessimistic?
I think so. I mean, I'm an optimist, so, you know, you can aim off for that. I don't want to try and extend your analogy because I'll make a mess of it. But I suppose what I would say is that the only way we can ultimately fix the foundations is making sure that local government is in the right shape to succeed into the future. And that's why we don't think that there is any element of this reform, from funding, distribution through to local government reorganisation, that we can't try to achieve. We need to achieve all of it.
We need them. I mean, people dispute the PwC report, but it says, I think, for when there are 25 two-tier areas, you save £2.9 billion over 5 years. That's all money that can be reinvested in services. And you have been rightly holding us to account on the critical state of local government finances. We just need that money. We don't have a choice. We've got to do both because the situation is so serious.
I also think the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Local Government have been absolutely clear that this is not something that's going to get sorted overnight, that there will be difficult choices, and I think they feel like they've already taken some difficult choices, and that we think it will be better, and we think it's the right thing to do, but we think it's not going to be without noise or without difficulty, and we will need to continue to work very closely with the sector.
We totally don't underestimate the complexity and difficulty, and indeed, like, genuinely, the capacity constraints in councils to get all of this done. But we think it all needs to be done.
I mean, does we follow that? I mean, successive governments for years have kept giving local government more and more functions that they're expected to turn out to do, and yet without funding them properly. And the net result is that the whole system has become worse. It's become more and more indebted. Surely what we need to do, the fundamental thing we need to do in the future, is whatever functions we allocate to local governments, we've got to fund them properly. Make sure that the needs are addressed, send needs are addressed, and then fund them properly.
I mean, you're raising a set of questions about new burdens and how they function, and I think we would recognise some of those issues. At the same time, I think, you know, some of the problems that we've been describing here are about the fact that you set out a distributional mechanism and then, for whatever reason, don't change it over time, and so keeping those things updated, I think, is also very important.
Yeah, so I'll bring in a second slide. Just one more from me, and this is it. I mean, in relation to SEND, which is, you know, the demand is, the system is broken, as we said in our report. Are we really going to get a whole system reform in the child?
I mean, I'm afraid for the detail of that, you need to be speaking to Susan, to my colleague Susan Ackland-Hood, and not to me. But we keep an extremely close touch with officials at the Department for Education who are as conscious of the need for this to be a fundamental reform as we are. And, you know, the financing, as you, from the paragraph that you read out, alone makes that necessary. But as we've touched on several times during this, the outcomes for children and parents as well.
They're the people we really need to be caring about, is the children and the parents. Clive, Bess.
Final point from me. Clearly, a lot of the drivers of costs in local government come from outside your department, the Department of Health, the Department of Education in particular. Do you have concerns looking at local government as a democratic institution and the responsibility to local people, that there is a real breakdown now in terms of many in our communities who don't get social care, don't have a child getting special education, and they just see what they get from their council, the road swept, the grass cut, the street lights on, the bins emptied, deteriorating. But every year they get 5% on their council tax bill and seem they're getting less services. And people write to me and say, but what's it for? Why am I paying more and getting less? Isn't that a real undermining of the whole principle and purpose of local government? Are you concerned about that? Are you doing anything to evaluate
concerned
that?
About anything that undermines the health of local government, which I think does an unbelievably important job and is absolutely critical to joining up services that really respond to local needs. And I think some of the conversation we had earlier about some of the sort of non-statutory sort of discretionary services actually speaks very much to the point about why it matters to create healthy communities and not just deal with the sort of acute end of services. And I think a lot of our reforms, and indeed the reforms of my colleagues around government being driven by ministers in their departments, are about that problem.
Has your department done any formal assessment about what's actually happened in terms of what local government are actually able to deliver now in terms of those ongoing services to communities as a whole in place, and what reductions there have actually been in terms of people's experience of local government services and the amount extra they're being asked to pay?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all we look at it as part of any spending review. We will look at that. The second thing I was saying earlier, that when you look at the kind of outcomes of local government, there is a clear link between relative funding in the system and outcomes, and places that are relatively receiving less money achieve worse outcomes on everything from potholes to leisure to children's and adult social care. So I think we look at that very closely. We also, as Sarah said, run the new burdens framework. I think we are doing a lot of work with our ministers at the moment about whether that is still the right way of doing it, and whether we need to think more about that. And I would expect that we would say more about that in any June consultation where ministers decide to do anything differently. But the answer is yes. We think about all of those things a lot.
Do you actually do any formal assessment which is published?
I mean, this is a very complicated picture, as you know, because there's lots of different inputs here. There's issues to do with what the effective reforms are likely to be, kind of as we've discussed during this hearing. So as part of a spending review, we look at in the round when we're discussing with Conrad and his colleagues where we may end up on a settlement for local government, all of the different issues that affect future funding. And indeed, the consultation on reform of funding sets out in quite a lot of detail the approach that we're proposing might be used in future to assess needs in order to create funding that matches them better.
I thank our witnesses very much. We don't underestimate the huge and complex task that you've got ahead of you. And we wish you well on behalf of all our citizens. We really hope you do succeed and do deliver on their behalf, but we don't envy you in the job you've got. So thank you very much indeed for your time today, and we will no doubt examine some of these, all of these issues again before too long. So an uncorrected transcript of this hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days, and as I've already indicated, the committee will consider the evidence you've provided today and will produce a report with recommendations in due course. Thank you again very much.